There is a specific feeling that comes with thinking you know something completely and then having the ground shift underneath you without warning. Pokémon fans understand this feeling better than most people. You've grown up with these games. You have thousands of hours logged across a dozen different entries in the series. You can recite the type chart without thinking, hum the battle themes for every gym leader in order, describe the layout of the Safari Zone from a mental image you haven't consciously called up in 15 years. You feel fluent in this world in a way that few fictional universes allow you to feel, and then someone tells you something you've genuinely never heard before, a fragment from a development document that never made it into any retrospective. A piece of dialogue, sitting 6 layers deep in unused code, written for a feature that was cut 3 months before the game shipped. A design decision so unexpected and so specific that you have to let it settle before it fully makes sense. And the whole franchise opens back up again wider and stranger, and more interesting than you thought you'd left it, which is exactly the feeling that brought you to Pokémon in the first place. That is what tonight is. 150 of those moments. A slow, unhurried walk through the spaces that exist between what the franchise shows you and what it has never quite gotten around to telling you. Some of these facts come from the games themselves, hidden in code, buried in dialogue, sitting in tiled data that wasn't supposed to be accessible. Some come from the anime's complicated production history, from banned episodes and scrapped character arcs and decisions that shaped decades of storytelling. Some come from the trading card game's earliest and strangest print runs. Some come from development documents, fan archaeology, data mining communities, and the long-form investigative work of people who love this franchise enough to spend years pulling it apart to understand how it works. All of them are real. All of them are the kind of thing that, once you know it, settles into the way you see the franchise permanently. So get comfortable. Take a slow breath. We've got a long way to go, and there's absolutely no need to rush. Part 1. The origin story, how Pokémon almost didn't exist, and the boy who made it anyway. To understand Pokémon at any depth that goes beyond surface knowledge, you need to understand where it actually came from. Not the franchise as it exists in its current form, the merchandise empire, the competitive scene with its global tournaments, the animated films that fill international theaters, the mobile game that brought hundreds of millions of people into the franchise who had never touched a Game Boy. You need to understand the raw, uncertain, chronically underfunded, nearly bankrupted origin that came perilously close to collapsing before any of it had a chance to exist. Satoshi Tajiri was born on the 28th of August 1965 in a district of Tokyo called Setagaya and grew up in a suburb called Machida. In the years of his childhood, the mid-1960s through the mid-1970s, Machida still retained the quality of somewhere that hadn't fully been absorbed by the city. There were fields along its edges where the built environment hadn't yet arrived. There were ponds and drainage ditches where standing water collected, and the organisms that depend on standing water could be found in significant numbers and variety. There were patches of undergrowth weeds, really, the kind of growth that occupies space that nothing organized has claimed where insects lived, in numbers that rewarded the attention of someone willing to be patient. Tajiri was that person from an early age. He gave the natural world the quality of obsessive attention that other children gave to sports or games or television. He crawled through undergrowth. He turned over rocks in creek beds. He waded into shallow water up to the tops of his rubber boots, looking. He wasn't just catching things for the pleasure of having caught them. He was studying them, noting the differences between species, tracking where different creatures preferred to live, what conditions they thrived in, how their behaviors varied. He traded finds with friends in the neighborhood, the specific social dimension of showing someone something they'd never seen before, the currency of discovery among children who shared a vocabulary of curiosity. His classmates gave him a nickname, Dr. Bug. When adults asked what he wanted to be, he told them he planned to be an entomologist, someone who studies insects scientifically. This was a genuine aspiration, not a child's whim. Nobody who knew him during those years would have predicted what he actually became, mostly because what he became had not yet been invented. The landscape that formed him was being transformed while he was growing up. Makida, in the 1970s, was being consumed by the expansion of Tokyo's urban sprawl at a pace that was visible in real time, if you paid the kind of attention Tajiri paid to his surroundings. Fields became construction sites. Ponds were drained and filled in. The patches of undergrowth, where he had spent entire afternoons finding new creatures, were cleared for roads and parking and apartment buildings. The natural world he had built his interior life around shrank back from the expanding city and became inaccessible to him in ways that felt like genuine loss. This wasn't nostalgia for something comfortably in the past. It was watching the thing that mattered most to him disappear while it was still happening. That loss became part of how he thought about things. Not as bitterness. Exactly, Tajiri has not been a bitter person in any of the interviews and accounts that survive, but as a kind of specific ache, the awareness of an absence that had been a presence, and a desire to give others the experience that was being taken from the landscape. He found a replacement in video games during his teenage years. The late 1970s and early 1980s in Japan were a period of genuine arcade culture, and Tajiri was drawn into it with the same absorption he'd brought to insect collecting. The underlying pleasure was structurally similar in his telling, a set of rules that could be mastered, a system whose logic could be understood deeply if you were patient enough, a specific kind of satisfaction that came from figuring out something that initially seemed opaque. In 1981, at 16 years old, he began writing a self-published gaming magazine he called Game Freak. It was initially handwritten, printed on accessible materials, and distributed primarily in the arcades, where he spent most of his time. By any reasonable definition, it was a fanzine, writing about something beloved for other people who loved the same thing. A young illustrator named Ken Sugimori began contributing artwork. They became close friends. Sugimori's visual sensibility, clean lines, slightly whimsical proportions, a naturalist's attention to the details that make a creature feel biologically distinctive rather than generically designed, would eventually define how a generation of children imagined fictional animals. In the early 1980s, he was making drawings for a gaming magazine with a circulation of a few thousand readers. The magazine ran for years, growing incrementally, developing a modest audience among gaming enthusiasts. It ended around 1986. Tajiri and Sugimori spent the years that followed building skills, studying programming, and constructing the infrastructure to make Game Freak into something beyond a publication. In 1989, they formally incorporated the company as a development studio and released their first product, Mendel Palace, a puzzle game for the Famicom, published by Namco. It was competent. It sold modestly. It didn't dramatically succeed, but it proved that Game Freak could take a concept from idea to finished retail product, and that proof of concept was the foundation everything else required. The insight that eventually became Pokémon came from watching children in an arcade use a link cable to connect two Game Boy systems. Tajiri had seen this many times. The cable was designed to allow two players to compete in games like Tetris or to trade items between game sessions. But watching the physical cable itself on a particular occasion, watching it stretch between two devices, like a channel, a pathway, a tunnel, between two separate worlds, something clicked in his imagination. He pictured a creature traveling through the cable, something living, moving from one device to the other, crossing between worlds through that thin gray wire. The image collided with his insect-collecting childhood in a way that felt like recognition, the pleasure of finding something new in the wild, the social dimension of sharing that discovery with a friend, the desire to let someone else see what you'd seen. A game where you captured creatures in tall grass and shallow water, raised them, and could send them to a friend through that cable. A game about discovery and connection. A game that could give every child who had grown up in a city the feeling he had grown up with and then lost. He pitched the concept to Nintendo around 1990. The reception was cautious at best. The Game Boy was aging hardware by then, and building a major release around a peripheral accessory that most Game Boy owners rarely used seemed commercially questionable. But Shigeru Miyamoto, the creator of Mario and The Legend of Zelda, the person at Nintendo whose creative instincts had been validated most spectacularly and whose support carried institutional weight, looked at Tajiri's vision and saw something in it. Miyamoto advocated for the project internally. Nintendo agreed to fund it. What followed was 6 years. 6 years of development during which Game Freak came to the edge of ceasing to exist on multiple occasions. The company was chronically underfunded throughout the development period. 5 employees quit during those 6 years, unable to continue working without consistent pay. Tajiri himself drew no salary for extended periods, borrowing money from his father to cover his personal expenses. He slept at the office rather than going home to an apartment. He worked in marathon sessions that stretched through the night, followed by brief periods of sleep wherever he happened to be, then more marathon sessions. His coworkers, who by all accounts respected him deeply while finding him genuinely difficult to understand as an ordinary human being, gave him a private nickname that translated roughly as homeless man, not cruelly, but in acknowledgement of how rarely he seemed to leave the building or attend to the ordinary requirements of daily life. The first obscure fact in this list is also the one that establishes the frame for understanding everything that follows. The original design for Pokémon Red and Green called for not 151 Pokémon, but 190. Game Freak had designed that many creatures. They had sprites coded, cry data recorded, Pokédex entries drafted, and indexed positions in the game's data structure, established for 190 distinct species. As the cartridge filled to its absolute memory limit and the development budget required cuts, 39 of those Pokémon had to be removed. They didn't disappear cleanly. Their absence left a structural scar in the game's underlying data, a set of numbered positions that pointed to locations where valid data should have lived but didn't. Those empty positions are precisely why Missing No exists, which will be explored fully in the next section. For now, hold on to the understanding that the game you first played as a child was already a reduced version. The world of Pokémon started, on its very first day of existence, as an incomplete realization of something larger that Game Freak never got to show. Mew, the 151st Pokémon, has its own story within this story, and it's one of the more remarkable acts of quiet insubordination in game development history. Near the absolute end of the development process, when the game's code was essentially finalized and the cartridge's available memory was completely spoken for, a programmer named Shigeki Morimoto noticed a small block of unused memory that no other data had claimed. On his own initiative, without formally announcing it to the rest of the team, he inserted Mew into that block. The creature was complete, a real Pokémon with legitimate statistics, a proper cry, a working sprite, and index position 151 in the Pokédex. When the game went to manufacturing, Mew was inside. Game Freak discovered it was there after the fact, and decided, rather than remove it, to treat it as a secret, a Pokémon they could reveal at a post-launch promotional event if the game needed a commercial boost after release. The boost turned out to be unnecessary. Pokémon Red and Green found their audience quickly enough that no emergency promotional card was needed. But Mew's existence spread through the Japanese player community, with the particular velocity that only a genuinely good secret achieves, and the mythology that accumulated around it became one of the franchise's defining elements before the games had even crossed the Pacific. The development working title tells a story too. Game Freak called the project Pocket Monsters too internally for much of its development. This seems strange in retrospect, because the franchise later presented Red and Green as the origin point. The explanation is that Game Freak had been involved in a tangential way with an earlier, separate Pocket Monsters property before developing what became the Pokémon games, giving their new project the sequel designation internally before the retail branding was settled. By the time the game shipped in Japan in February 1996, it was Pokémon Red and Pokémon Green. When it reached international markets, the name was further condensed partly for trademark clarity and partly for ease of recognition outside Japan. The starting town name is a piece of trivia that tends to produce a strong reaction when people encounter it for the first time. In the early development builds of Gold and Silver, the player's starting hometown was called Silent Hills. This has absolutely no connection to the Konami horror franchise of the same name, which wouldn't arrive until several years later. It was a placeholder, an evocative working name that the team used before the final Johto town names were settled. The coincidence is striking. Johto, as a region, has always carried something slightly melancholy and old, quieter than Kanto, marked by tradition and history and the texture of somewhere that hasn't rushed to modernize. Silent Hills fits that atmosphere almost uncomfortably well. New Bark Town, the name that replaced it, emphasizes beginnings. new growth, fresh bark on wood that's still alive. Both names make emotional sense for the same location in different directions. The mascot selection is one of the franchise's most consequential alternate history pivot points. Before Pikachu became the public face of Pokémon to the world, the leading candidate was Clefairy. This made sense in multiple ways. Clefairy was round and pink and appealing across a broad demographic range. It had a design that read as universally cute without being gendered in obvious ways, and it had already been chosen as the protagonist's partner in the companion manga that was launching alongside the games in Japan. The manga, published under the title Pokémon Pocket Monsters in a popular Japanese magazine, starred a character named Red and his Clefairy partner. But this Clefairy was not the gentle, somewhat passive creature that appears in the games and anime. The manga's Clefairy was an absurdist comedy character of some intensity. Loud, frequently scheming, regularly getting itself and others into trouble through incompetence or deliberate mischief, prone to breaking the fourth wall to address readers directly, and given to commentary on other characters that ranged from critical to outright insulting. This was not the Pokémon franchise's mascot in any form that would be recognizable to international audiences. International readers who never encountered the manga had no idea this version of Clefairy existed, and the franchise built a completely different identity around whichever creature was chosen instead. Pikachu was selected over Clefairy for a combination of practical reasons. Focus group testing showed that Pikachu's design appealed to a broader demographic sample than Clefairy's. Both boys and girls responded well to the electric mouse, while Clefairy tested as slightly more appealing to girls than boys in the specific samples used. Electric attacks were also simply more visually exciting in promotional material. Lightning bolts crossing a frame, sparks exploding in battle. The aesthetic drama of electrical discharge was far more dynamic than anything a normal-type Clefairy had available to it. Bright yellow against dark backgrounds worked well in the marketing contexts Nintendo was planning to use. The franchise's commercial machinery made a choice based on sound reasoning. That choice rewired the identity of one of the most recognized commercial brands in the history of global entertainment. Ken Sugimori's design sequence has been discussed in various interviews over the years and is worth understanding precisely. The first creature coded into the game's internal data index, the numerical catalog of Pokémon positions that the code uses to reference which Pokémon is, which is Rhydon. The large, armored, rhino-like creature appears at index position 1 in the original red and green data, before the Pokédex numbers were reorganized for the final retail version of the game. But the first creature Sugimori drew on paper as a conceptual sketch for the franchise before any coding existed, before the game's structure was settled, when the project was still a concept being worked out through design, was Clefairy. First sprite in the code was Rhydon. First sketch on paper was Clefairy. And the reason that the decorative statues and stone monuments throughout Kanto and Johto look like Rhydon is that Rhydon's design was the game's oldest completed piece of graphic art, embedded in the game's visual environment before anyone stopped to ask whether it was the most appropriate choice for decorative purposes. The original Pokédex concept was not a device at all. Early development sketches from Game Freak's archives show it as a physical notebook, something the player character would write in by hand, recording their observations about each Pokémon they encountered, the way a naturalist's field journal records observations from a day in the wilderness. The high-tech digital gadget that became the Pokédex emerged as Game Freak refined the game's identity and leaned into its particular aesthetic balance. A world where extraordinary creatures live wild in nature, alongside a protagonist equipped with advanced technology. A pocket encyclopedia that grows with your discoveries, that records your progress toward complete knowledge, embodies that balance better than a handwritten notebook, and became one of gaming's most frequently imitated interface concepts in the decades that followed. The financial desperation of the development period is documented in enough places to be taken seriously as fact rather than legend. Multiple accounts describe the company's bank account reaching zero during the 6-year development. Tajiri's approach to the situation was to simply refuse to acknowledge it as a reason to stop working. He went without pay. He borrowed from his family. He slept at the studio. He worked in the particular pattern of someone for whom the project's completion had become inseparable from his sense of self. When Red and Green finally shipped in February 1996, after 6 years of this, the games found their audience quickly. Within months, Pokémon had become a cultural force in Japan. Within 2 years, it had crossed the Pacific and begun the process of becoming a global cultural force. The near bankruptcy that characterized its creation was followed almost immediately by commercial success of a scale that the development team could not have allowed themselves to imagine during the worst years. Before we keep going, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I genuinely love knowing where these videos reach. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. We're only getting started. Part 2. Generation 1's Buried World Glitches, Phantom Code, and what the cartridge was hiding. Pokémon Red and Blue have been studied with the focused, almost archaeological intensity that scholars usually reserve for ancient manuscripts. Decades of speedrunning, data mining, fan reverse engineering, and obsessive repeated play have produced a community that understands these cartridges at the level of individual memory addresses. The games are small by modern standards. Each cartridge holds about 1 megabyte of data, and yet they contain hidden complexity that surprised the people who made them and continued surprising players for years after. Release. Game Boy programming in the mid-1990s was an exercise in working at the absolute edge of what the hardware could support, and the compromises made in that process had consequences that cascaded in directions nobody anticipated. Missing No is where this section starts. Not because it's obscure, it's one of the most famous glitches in gaming history, but because the actual story of what Missing No is, why it exists, and what it means is less well understood than the glitch itself. The common description of Missing No as an accident, as simple corrupted data that appeared by chance, is imprecise in a way that matters. Missing No exists because Game Freak built a system that needed placeholders. The original design planned for 190 Pokémon. When the final cartridge could accommodate only 151 fully finished creatures, 39 had to be removed from the roster before the game shipped. Their indexed positions in the game's data structure couldn't simply be deleted because the code pointed to those positions from many different places: item tables, encounter rate tables, Pokédex lookup calls, evolution pathway references. Each of these cross-references assumed that something valid would exist at each numbered slot. Removing the slots without rebuilding every system that referenced them would have been an enormous engineering task at the end of a 6-year development process that was already pushing every available limit. So Game Freak populated those empty slots with placeholder data. No legitimate sprite, no proper cry, no real statistical profile. Just enough data to prevent the game from crashing when its systems tried to load something from a position that had been left empty. Missing No was the visible result of this engineering solution. When the game loaded one of those placeholder slots and tried to render what should have been a Pokémon, it produced whatever it found in the surrounding memory, which, because of how Game Boy memory worked, was typically noise, static, the visual equivalent of a radio frequency tuned between stations. The L-shaped pixelated static sprite that players encountered wasn't designed by anyone. It was generated by the game's rendering system, doing its best with data that had no legitimate content associated with it. The name was an internal debug label, Missing Number, something the development team used to identify empty slots during testing, never intended to be seen by players. The text should never have been accessible during normal gameplay. The reason it was accessible comes from the mechanics of the Old Man glitch. When you speak to the Old Man in Viridian City, who demonstrates the Pokémon catching mechanic, the game needs to display a catch sequence on screen. That sequence requires the catcher to have a name, in this case, the Old Man. The game temporarily writes the Old Man's name into a block of memory that normally stores your player name, runs the demonstration, and then restores your player name when it's done. But the memory addresses used for this swap overlapped with the block the game used to store encounter data for the most recently traversed route. When you subsequently navigated to the eastern coast of Cinnabar Island, a narrow strip of coastline where a map boundary quirk made the game read encounter data from whatever was currently loaded in that memory block, it used the character codes of your player name's letters as index values to determine what Pokémon appeared. Characters whose ASCII code values corresponded to the numbered positions of those empty placeholder slots produced Missing No or other placeholder creatures. The Pokemon you encountered wasn't random corrupted data, it was specifically determined by your player name, which is why players who knew the glitch could somewhat predict what would appear based on what they'd named their character. The item duplication happened because the game stored the item quantity for your bag's 6th slot in memory that was adjacent to the encounter counter for the current battle. When Missing No appeared, and the game ran its encounter tracking code, it incremented a counter that ran into the item quantity field in an adjacent memory location, pushing that quantity upward. Repeated encounters could push the quantity toward 255, the maximum value the memory slot could hold. Whatever item sat in that 6th slot accumulated toward a quantity of 99 plus. Players who placed rare candies or master balls in that position could accumulate enormous quantities of those items through repeated encounters. This was not designed. It was a memory collision that happened to produce something players found extremely useful. But Missing No was only the most visible placeholder in those empty slots. Dozens of other phantom entities occupied different positions in that same space, each with its own identifier, its own audio data pulled from wherever the sound system found something to play, its own visual data assembled from surrounding memory addresses. Some of these were genuinely dangerous to interact with. The creature designated M, sometimes notated as the M glyph, occupied a different index position than standard Missing No, and had a different behavior profile. Catching M and saving the game afterward could corrupt save file data, particularly the Hall of Fame records, where the game stored information about your Elite Four victories. The corruption could progress in ways that made the save file unstable, eventually preventing it from loading. Other placeholder entities had stat values that exceeded the normal limits the game applied to designed Pokemon, making them statistically more powerful than anything in the official roster, while being completely unpredictable in their behavior during battle. Players who encountered these intentionally, usually through deliberate code manipulation rather than accidental discovery, were interacting with something whose behavior couldn't be reliably anticipated. Missing No became famous partly because it was relatively safe. You could encounter it, duplicate your items, and resume normal play without catastrophe. Its more dangerous neighbors in the placeholder list were less forgiving. The Mew glitch is architecturally different from the Old Man glitch, and understanding it reveals something elegant about how the game's memory worked. The glitch exploits the way the game handles encounters with trainers who notice you. When a trainer on the map sees you and moves toward you to initiate a battle, the game stores that trainer's battle data, the trainer's Pokemon, their AI settings, their post-battle dialogue at a specific memory address in preparation for loading the battle screen. If you can open the player menu and execute a movement ability like Fly or Teleport before the battle screen actually opens, which requires extremely precise timing and only works from specific map positions, the game stores the pending battle in memory, but marks it as incomplete. You've fled from a battle that hadn't technically started yet. When you subsequently encounter a wild Ditto and it uses Transform, the transformation pulls from memory to determine what to become. Under the specific conditions created by the incomplete stored battle, the reference chain resolves to Mew's legitimate Pokédex index position, the position where Morimoto hid the Pokémon at the end of development. Mew appears in the wild battle, level 7, catchable with a standard Pokéball, with the full and functional statistics of an official Mew obtained through any other means. In 1996 and 1997, children who somehow executed this sequence, usually by following instructions that had traveled through several intermediate tellers and arrived barely resembling their original form, were completely bewildered by what they found. The playground mythology that developed around Mew was extraordinary in its creativity. It was hidden under the truck near the SS. Anne, obtainable by beating the Elite Four a specific number of times, accessible by catching every other Pokemon in a specific order, reachable through an item combination nobody had quite identified yet. The truth was stranger and more elegant than any of those stories, involving a memory addressing coincidence that required specific sequence knowledge to exploit. The focus energy glitch is one of the most consequential and least discussed design failures in the original games. Focus energy, as described in its in-game text, raises the user's critical hit rate, increasing the probability of landing critical hits that deal double damage. Competitive players in the late 1990s who used it noticed that their critical hits appeared to become less frequent, not more. They were right. Due to a programming error in how the game handled the critical hit probability calculation, using focus energy set a bit flag that the calculation function checked backward, reading it as a signal to reduce the critical hit rate rather than raise it. The move functioned as the precise opposite of what its description promised. This was not a small margin of error. Focus energy actively made the Pokémon who used it perform worse. A trainer who built their strategy around maximizing critical hits and used focus energy to support that strategy was undermining themselves with every use. The bug was not identified and corrected until Generation 3. For the entirety of the first and second generations of the franchise, focus energy was a trap. The competitive guides of that era noted to avoid it, usually without fully understanding the mechanism responsible. The Ghost-type immunity to Psychic-type moves represents another foundational design error with lasting structural consequences for the franchise. The original type chart was built around the logic that Psychic types would be vulnerable to Ghost moves thematically. The Supernatural and the Psychic were opposed, and mechanically, this would have created an important counterbalancing weakness for a type that was otherwise extremely powerful in Generation 1. The game shipped with Psychic types immune to Ghost moves instead. Ghost-type Pokémon also had almost no effective offensive options in Generation 1. Lick was essentially the only Ghost-type attack move, and it didn't connect meaningfully with the mechanics it was supposed to support. The Ghost-type as a whole was nearly useless offensively. The type's supposed primary target was immune to it, and the available Ghost moves were inadequate even against targets that took neutral damage. The post-hoc narrative that appeared in some early player guides that Psychic trainers feared Ghost types, explaining the immunity as a psychological effect, was mythology applied to a coding error. The correction didn't arrive until Pokémon Gold and Silver, when the type chart was revised. Haunter and Gengar, in Generation 1, were strong Pokémon in spite of their Ghost typing rather than because of it. Fishing inside gym statues is a small glitch with considerable charm and no narrative explanation. The game's tile system classifies the lower portion of several decorative stone statues at gym entrances as water tiles, apparently because the visual treatment of stone and water at that scale shared similar attributes that the tile classification didn't distinguish carefully enough. This means that a player standing adjacent to one of these statues and casting a fishing rod in the direction of the statue receives a valid fishing response. The game believes you are fishing in water. You are standing in a gym foyer. The wild encounter that results is usually Magikarp, because Magikarp is the default result for basic tier fishing encounters in Kanto's water tiles. Nothing breaks. The gym functions normally. There is simply, inexplicably, a Magikarp inside a stone idol. The invisible PC in Celadon City is one of those glitches that reveals exactly how game development actually works under time pressure. In a specific house in the city, a house that contains no visible PC, pressing the A button on a particular tile produces a complete PC interaction. The game opens the Pokémon storage system exactly as it would if you were standing in front of a working PC. The cause is mundane. A developer, building this room's map data, copied it from another house that did contain a PC. When copying the data, they didn't remove the PC's interaction script from the specific tile where it had been active in the source room. The PC became invisible in the new room because it was never given a visual sprite there, but its functionality remained embedded in the tile data. Players in the original games era who discovered this treated it as a significant secret, a hidden PC, a secret access point, something that implied a connected discovery. It was a copy-paste oversight. The PC works. Nothing else connects to it. Bill's Secret Garden is the community name for a patch of land that can be reached behind Bill's cottage on the coast through a specific surfing direction glitch. The area exists as accessible tiles outside the game's intended navigation boundaries. Nothing is there. No items, no encounters, no triggered events. The land was presumably part of the coastal geography that the map system included without intending it to be walkable. But in a game where hidden content was real and required unusual access methods to reach, an inaccessible area was automatically a potential door. Fan theories described rare Pokémon, hidden items, and secret rooms accessible through sequences nobody had quite identified. The area was empty. The mystery it generated was real. The inaccessible item in the Safari Zone gate is the franchise's strangest persistent mystery. Using the item finder, the key item that detects buried hidden items on a specific tile in the gate area produces an alert. The device registers an item nearby. That item is positioned at a map coordinate that sits outside the navigable boundary in the game's black void. Reaching the coordinate requires traversing through the void, which causes the game's movement and collision systems to behave erratically or crash. The item's identity isn't specified in any data the community has been able to access. It exists at a confirmed coordinate with confirmed presence, permanently unreachable. Nobody has ever collected it. Nobody ever will. Part 3. What the Pokédex was hiding. The franchise's carefully measured darkness. There is a version of Pokémon that is completely safe and warm and comfortable. It's the version the franchise leads with. The version on the box art and in the promotional trailers. Colorful creatures, gentle adventure, a world where the worst thing that can happen to your Pokémon is that they faint in battle and wake up fine at the nearest Pokémon Center. That version isn't wrong. It's what the games deliver most of the time. Underneath it is something else. A writer or team of writers at Game Freak has been placing carefully measured darkness into the Pokédex entries since the franchise's very first games. Not gratuitously, not carelessly, but with the measured precision of people who understood exactly what they were doing and how much the small text boxes could hold without breaking the larger experience. The world of Pokémon, if you read the Pokédex entries with full attention, contains death and grief and predation and horror of various kinds. The games hand this information to you in 2 or 3 sentences at a time, in the same format as, "This Pokémon lives near rivers," or "This Pokémon eats berries," and then let you continue your adventure as if the disclosure was entirely routine. Begin with the geography. Lavender Town in Generation 1 sits in the northeast of Kanto, accessible through Rock Tunnel. It is small, no commercial district, no gym, no functional center for trade or travel. What it has instead of a gym is the Pokémon Tower, a 7-story building filled with grave markers, a mausoleum, a place where trainers go to bury and mourn their dead Pokémon because Pokémon in this world die, and the game has been careful up to this point not to tell you so directly. Your Pokémon have fainted in battles throughout your journey. They have always woken up at Pokémon centers, recoverable, never gone permanently. Lavender Town removes that protective fiction without announcement. The grave markers represent real deaths. The Pokémon memorialized, they are not coming back. The music that accompanies Lavender Town was composed by Junichi Masuda and is one of the most effective pieces of atmospheric design in the franchise's history. It's a high-register chiptune piece built around a dissonant minor key with a tonal quality that sits slightly wrong without being precisely nameable. Masuda designed it to signal that players had walked somewhere genuinely different from the rest of their journey, a place where the rules of Kanto's essentially cheerful atmosphere didn't fully apply. The piece has succeeded in this function for 3 decades. Players who haven't heard it in years can often recall, with some precision, how it made them feel as children. In 2010, a horror story appeared on internet writing communities claiming that the original Japanese version of Pokémon Red and Green contained high-frequency tones in the Lavender Town music that were audible only to children and young adolescents, causing a documented spike in suicides and illness among Japanese children aged 7 to 12 in the weeks following the game's release in February 1996. The story named specific victims, claimed specific medical mechanisms, and attributed specific motivations to Game Freak's response, including a claim that the international release had the frequencies lowered specifically to prevent recurrence in other markets. The story was fiction, a creepypasta, a genre of internet horror, writing that presents invented accounts in the format of documentary evidence or first-person testimony. No documented spike in childhood deaths occurred in Japan following the release of the games. There is no altered version of the music containing dangerous frequencies. The Lavender Town theme does differ between Japanese and international releases, but these differences are the product of ordinary version-to-version music revision, not a response to a health emergency. The significance of the Lavender Town Syndrome story is what it reveals about how the town's atmosphere worked. An urban legend explaining why a piece of music from a children's game could make people feel genuinely afraid was plausible enough to spread widely and persist for years. People invented a mass medical crisis because they needed a reason for an experience they'd actually had. Now, the actual Pokédex darkness, which is real, documented, and in many ways more disturbing than any creepypasta because it was put there on purpose. Yamask was introduced in Pokémon Black and White, carrying a mask with a human face on it. The Pokédex entries across multiple games are consistent on what this face is: Yamask's own face. From when it was alive, from when it was a human being. The mask is a casting of the creature's former human face, carried with it after its transformation into a ghost-type Pokémon. The Black version entry states that each one of these masks is a record of the face the person had when alive. The Pokémon sometimes holds the mask up and cries. The entry continues, overcome by memories of the life it had. This is not ambiguous. Yamask was a person. Whatever process transformed it, it retained its memories and its face. It weeps over what it has lost. This information appears in the game's compendium of species information in the same format as any other entry, in the same text box, at the same size font. Hypno has been one of the franchise's quietly disturbing presences since its introduction. The creature is derived from the Baku of Japanese folklore, a protective spirit that consumes nightmares, traditionally summoned by parents to eat away their children's bad dreams. The Pokémon takes this origin and pushes it in a different direction. Multiple Pokédex entries across different games describe Hypno wandering the streets at night, swinging its pendulum, putting passers-by to sleep, and carrying them away. The Gold entry names an event. A child in a neighborhood was once taken by a Hypno. The child was never found. This is not a speculative warning about what Hypno might do. It is a documented account of what it did. Fire Red adds a practical instruction in the entry's text. If you encounter Hypno swinging its pendulum, do not make direct eye contact with it. These are not flavor text flourishes. They are safety warnings. The Pokédex is telling players how to avoid becoming a predator's victim. Drifloon in Pokémon Diamond and Pearl looks like a cheerful balloon ghost type with a rounded, friendly design. Its Pokédex entry states that the Pokémon grabs children by the hand and attempts to drag them away, specifically toward the spirit world. Later entries soften this somewhat. Drifloon isn't consistently strong enough to succeed, and children who encounter it usually end up dragging Drifloon rather than being dragged by it. This mitigation doesn't change what Drifloon is trying to do. Its instinctive behavior is to take children away from the world of the living. The Diamond entry additionally specifies that if a Drifloon is popped, the sound that escapes is the spirit's cry. This is a Pokémon that screams when it dies. Spiritomb is composed of 108 spirits. This number carries weight in Buddhist and Japanese folk traditions that the franchise is drawing on deliberately. 108 represents the earthly temptations and afflictions that bind humans to the cycle of suffering, and Buddhist temples strike their bells 108 times at the new year to symbolically cleanse the accumulated sins of the passing year. Spiritomb is 108 individual entities, bound together in a stone and imprisoned there as punishment for unspecified transgressions committed 500 years before the player encounters it. 5 centuries of imprisonment is a duration that gives the word punishment real weight. Something judged these 108 entities, decided they deserved to be bound together indefinitely, and enacted that judgment. The player who catches Spiritomb and puts it in their PC box has released 108 souls from 5 centuries of communal imprisonment and decided to use them as a competitive asset. Drowsy and Hypno's Baku origins are developed in ways that extend into uncomfortable territory across multiple generations of Pokédex entries. Drowsy remembers every dream it has ever consumed. It can reconstruct a person's history and inner life from the dreams it has eaten from them. It specifically prefers children's dreams because the flavor is sweeter. The act of consuming someone's dreams here is not a benign protective service. It is the extraction of psychic content memories, experiences, subconscious processing from a sleeping person who has no ability to consent to the process or prevent it. The folkloric Baku was summoned by parents to help children. The Pokémon is an autonomous predator that finds sleeping individuals and takes from them. Golduck's origins in the Kappa mythology of Japanese folklore are worth understanding in full. Kappa in traditional Japanese stories are ambivalent water spirits, sometimes helpful but more often dangerous. Beings that inhabit rivers and ponds, lure people to the water's edge, and drag them beneath the surface. The Pokémon Shield entry for Golduck draws on this directly. Golduck punishes those who defile its river by dragging them into the water and carrying them away. The phrasing is clinical and specific. What happens to the person being dragged into the water by a creature based on a folklore spirit known for drowning people is left to inference. Banette's origin story is one of the franchise's most emotionally focused pieces of monster design. The Pokémon began as an ordinary plush toy that a child threw away. The toy, filled with grief and resentment at being discarded, at being decided to be not worth keeping, became possessed by those emotions and pulled itself free from wherever it had been sent. It began searching for the child responsible. The zipper mouth design is load-bearing. Banette must keep it closed to contain the negative energy that sustains its existence. If the zipper opens, what's inside dissipates. Banette cannot find resolution. The child who threw it away is likely an adult now, may have no memory of the toy, may never be located. Banette continues indefinitely, held together by a grudge directed at someone who probably doesn't know it exists. The Marowak ghost in Lavender Tower is the franchise's most direct and emotionally deliberate use of death as story element in the early games. On an upper floor of the tower, a ghost blocks the player's progress. Without the Sylph Scope obtained through a mission involving Team Rocket's Saffron City hideout, the ghost is invisible, a presence you can engage in battle but can't identify. With the Sylph Scope equipped, the ghost reveals itself as a Marowak, a ghost-type state impossible under normal game mechanics. Marowak doesn't evolve into a ghost type, and ghost-type Marowak doesn't exist in the normal roster. This is a Pokémon that is dead. Team Rocket killed it. It is haunting the site of its death and blocking the path because it has not moved on. When you defeat it in battle, it moves on. The act of witnessing it, seeing it for what it is, engaging with its existence directly, is apparently what allows it to leave. Part 4. The Beta World Pokémon that were almost real. The Space World 1997 Nintendo Trade Show demo of Pokémon Gold and Silver is one of the most remarkable documents in gaming history, and it survived almost entirely by accident. The demo, a playable prototype of the games that would eventually ship in 1999, was preserved in private hands for over 20 years after its demonstration. In May 2018, an anonymous user on the Pokémon Reverse Engineering Tools Discord server posted a download link. The community descended immediately. Within hours, the contents had been extracted and cataloged. Within days, the findings had been shared across every platform where Pokémon fans gathered and discussed. What the demo contained was a version of Generation 2 different enough from what shipped that significant portions were effectively unrecognizable as the same game. The beta Pokédex contained over 200 Pokémon. The final Gold and Silver had 251. The gap represents creatures that were designed, named, given types, and in many cases, complete sprites, and then removed before the game's released. Some were repurposed into other designs, some were consolidated, many were simply cut and haven't appeared in any official form since. Baby Pokémon were among the most striking absences. The Space World demo contains complete sprite data for baby forms of Doduo, Vulpix, Arcanine, Grimer, and Paris, among others. Each had names, type assignments, and appropriate Pokédex positioning ahead of their evolved forms. The final game did introduce baby forms for a significant number of existing Pokémon: Pichu, Cleffa, Igglybuff, Togepi, Elekid, Magby, Smoochum, and others. But the beta had planned to go much further. The cuts were almost certainly driven by cartridge space constraints and the development timeline that was already under pressure. Pinsir was supposed to evolve. The Space World demo contains data for a Pinsir evolution, a larger, more imposing creature built on the same visual vocabulary as the original. Pinsir's competitive history in Generation 1 was characterized by a stat profile that implied power the move pool couldn't fully support, and a distinctiveness that made it feel like it should have more presence in the roster than it did. The planned evolution would have addressed these issues directly. Instead, Pinsir remained a standalone creature for nearly 2 decades, until Mega Evolution arrived in Generation 6, as a different kind of upgrade through a different mechanic. The Water Steel Evolution line is among the most striking cuts in the Space World demo. 3 creatures, a small fish called Sunmola, evolving into a shark called Anchorgay, evolving into an eel-like creature called Grotess, were fully designed with Water Steel typing. That type combination didn't appear in any officially released game until Empoleon in Generation 4, which debuted in 2006. Had Sunmola's line shipped with gold and silver, an entire generation of players would have had access to the Water Steel combination 7 years earlier, and Empoleon's uniqueness would have looked very different. The Johto Firestarter was not Cyndaquil in the Space World 1997 build. The Firestarter was a completely different creature, rounded, bear-like, with flame-type characteristics. Its design was not simply cut, it was repurposed into Teddiursa, the normal-type bear Pokémon that players encounter in the wild in Gold and Silver's forested areas. Teddiursa's circular design, aesthetic, and its honey-based flavor text carry the recognizable traces of a Pokémon that was originally built for a different role entirely. The Cyndaquil line that became the canonical Johto Firestarter was a replacement for a design that had already progressed to an advanced state of completion. The rival character in the 1997 demo had a warmer aesthetic and different personality attributes than the Silver who appeared in the finished game. Silver's defining qualities, his dismissiveness toward Pokémon welfare, his belief that strength was the only meaningful attribute, his eventual redemption arc were not what the early character design suggested. The development of Silver into a sharply drawn antagonist who embodied a specific flawed worldview represented a significant creative evolution of the character during the 2 years between the Space World demo and the game's release. Town names across early Johto were entirely different. Goldenrod City had a different layout and different name. Ecruteak City had a medicine shop planned for a location that became Cianwood City in the final game. The player's starting hometown carried the working title Silent Hills, a placeholder with no connection to the Konami franchise of the same name, but strikingly atmospheric for Johto's eventual mood. The 2020 Nintendo GigaLeak added another dimension to the beta record. Internal development footage from the early Diamond and Pearl production period showed Pokémon designs in states substantially different from their final forms. Infernape's finalized visual design appeared in the footage as the middle evolution of a different Pokémon, entirely a large mandrill-like creature whose third form would have been Infernape's current design. The starting creature of that line is unknown. Glamow's planned evolution was sleeker and more elegantly designed than Purugly, making Purugly's name and ungainly proportions read retrospectively as a deliberate, creative decision, a conscious subversion of the expectation that a cat's evolution would be graceful. Delibird, a Christmas-themed ice-flying type that has been among the franchise's least competitively viable Pokémon across nearly 30 years of existence, had a planned evolution in the beta materials that was removed before the final game shipped. The evolution existed. It was designed. It was cut. Delibird has spent 3 decades as a standalone creature in a franchise that has given later evolutions to creatures introduced in the same generation. Yanma became Yanmega in Generation 4. Piloswine became Mamoswine in Generation 4. Girafarig became Farigiraf in Generation 9. Whether Delibird's original evolution design still exists in Game Freak's archives is unknown. Part 5. Lost in Translation. The Hidden World of Localization. Pokémon's journey from Japan to international markets was not a translation, but a reconstruction. Every layer of the franchise, the games, the anime, the card game, the merchandise, was adapted with thousands of decisions about what to keep, what to change, what to explain differently, and what to quietly remove. The result was that Pokémon fans in different countries experienced fundamentally different cultural artifacts while believing they were experiencing the same thing. The coughing and wheezing naming story is one of the franchise's most startling localization disclosures. In early development materials for Red and Green internal documentation from Game Freak's production process, not any public-facing material, the 2 poison gas Pokémon carried placeholder names, NY for coughing and LA for wheezing, abbreviations for New York City and Los Angeles. The joke was dry industrial. Two floating spherical Pokémon made entirely of toxic gas, named after the two American cities most internationally associated with smog and air pollution in the decades before the games were made. The names were changed before the games shipped in any market, but the fact that Game Freak was conceptualizing coughing and wheezing through the lens of American urban air quality while designing them suggests a very specific satirical intent behind their visual design. The Jelly Donut is the franchise's most famous localization substitution and the clearest window into a particular approach to international adaptation. Onigiri Japanese rice balls, typically triangular, wrapped in nori seaweed, a genuinely common and beloved snack food in Japan, appears throughout the original anime constantly. Characters eat them, Brock makes them, they sit in backgrounds of scenes, they're part of the visual texture of daily life in the show's world. When 4Kids, the American dubbing company responsible for the early English adaptation, encountered onigiri in the material, they made the decision that American children would not recognize or accept them. Rather than explain, which would have required a brief moment of cultural information, they renamed. The most famous instance is Brock producing clearly triangular, nori-wrapped rice balls and calling them jelly donuts. The shape, the color, and the description of the food share no attributes. In some episodes, animation cells were redrawn to replace Japanese food with American food, an investment of production resources in ensuring viewers didn't encounter a triangle-shaped snack without a Western label. The Team Rocket motto in English is catchy, memorable, and has embedded itself in millions of memories. The Japanese original is structurally different, poetic in its construction, drawing on a tradition of dramatic proclamation, referencing love, honor, and the romance of a certain kind of villainous self-perception. Jesse and James in Japanese are figures who take themselves seriously as agents of a grand cause, whose self-awareness is elaborate and theatrical. In English, they have the vocabulary of a budget magic act. Different countries receive different localizations of the motto entirely. Some are regarded by their regional fan communities as superior to the English version. Hitmonlee and Hitmonchan carry English names that reference Bruce Lee and Jackie Chan, clean and effective localization choices that make the fighting-type identities immediately readable. Their Japanese names honor different people. Hitmonlee is Sawamular in Japanese, named for Tadashi Sawamura, a kickboxing champion who died young and is remembered as a foundational figure in Japanese martial arts history. Hitmonchan is Ebiwalar, named for Hiroyuki Ebihara, a flyweight boxing champion with multiple world titles in the 1960s. The original names were tributes to Japanese sporting heroes, meaningful to the franchise's home audience. The Western localization replaced them with globally famous Hollywood figures, which worked commercially while completely erasing the original tribute. Jinx's design was changed following cultural sensitivity concerns that were raised publicly in 2000 and gained traction through subsequent years. The original design featured characteristics that critics compared to offensive caricature. The Pokémon Company changed the skin color from black to purple in subsequent releases. Less publicly discussed, certain older episodes featuring Jinx were retroactively re-edited for home video distribution, replacing the original design with the revised one. Depending on when you purchased early Pokémon episode releases on home video, your copies may look visually different from other editions of the same content. 2 versions of these scenes exist, and which one you have is a function of purchasing timing. Part 6. Banned and buried the episodes that never found their audience. The Pokémon anime ran continuously for over 25 years and produced more than 1,300 episodes. A small number of those episodes exist in a different category, produced, sometimes broadcast once, but unavailable through any current official distribution channel and never seen by the audiences they were made for. Episode 38, Den-O Senshi Porygon, aired once on the 16th of December, 1997, on TV Tokyo. Approximately 685 children were taken to hospitals across Japan that night with symptoms including seizures, nausea, and vision disturbance. The cause was identified as a 6-second sequence of rapidly alternating red and blue flashing frames during a scene in which Pikachu uses thunder to destroy missiles, creating the problematic visual effect. The show was suspended immediately. TV Tokyo issued a public apology. The Pokémon franchise went on a 4-month hiatus. Every previously broadcast episode was retroactively reviewed and adjusted for flash rate safety standards. A New Year's special, scheduled for December 31, 2 weeks after the incident, was cancelled before broadcast and has never aired anywhere. Pikachu's attack caused the flash. Porygon, whose name was in the episode's title and whose story the episode was telling, did nothing that contributed to the medical emergency. Because the episode bore Porygon's name, Porygon was removed from meaningful animated appearances thereafter. Porygon 2 and Porygon Z, introduced in later generations as the species' evolutions, received the same treatment by association. None of the three have had significant roles in the animated series since 1997. An animation accident caused by the wrong Pokémon's attack became a permanent part of the franchise's institutional record through attribution to the Pokémon who happened to be present rather than the one responsible. The Legend of Dratini created the most consequential narrative gap for Western audiences. The episode features Ash visiting the Kanto Safari Zone and catching 30 Tauros. It also features the elderly warden of the Safari Zone producing a revolver and pointing it at Ash in an early scene, then firing the weapon at Team Rocket. The firearms content made the episode unbroadcastable in international markets under the standards 4Kids was applying. It was never dubbed into English. It did not air in most international markets. Subsequent episodes showed Ash with 30 Tauros and offered no explanation of their origin. The Tauros simply existed in his possession, referenced in future episodes, obtainable as gifts in certain later games, permanent evidence of a story that Western audiences were not allowed to witness. The Mandarin Island mismatch removed a character development scene whose downstream effects persisted for many episodes after it. The episode features a skilled trainer named Prima who challenges Ash in ways that produce a marked shift in his approach to battles, a maturity development moment that subsequent episodes treated as established. Western audiences experienced the changed behavior in a contextual vacuum. The episode was cut because the battle sequences were deemed too intense for the standards being applied to the dub. The character change remained in episodes that followed it. An Earthquake episode involving Barboach, Whiscash, and The Move. Earthquake has never been broadcast anywhere in the world. Its scheduled broadcast date in Japan fell shortly after a devastating real earthquake that caused significant casualties. TV Tokyo withdrew it out of respect. It has never been reinstated. Earthquake, Fissure, and Magnitude have not been animated in the Pokémon series since. Part 7. The Invisible System's hidden mechanics nobody explained to you. One of the things that makes Pokémon unusual among long-running game franchises is the degree to which its most important mechanical systems were never explained to the people playing it. The games told you the rules of battle. They showed you type advantages. They walked you through catching and training. What they didn't tell you was that underneath every number you could see was a second layer of numbers you couldn't see, and those hidden numbers determined more about the outcome of your games than anything on the visible surface. Entire competitive ecosystems developed around understanding these invisible systems. Championships were won and lost because of attributes the game never mentioned in any tutorial. Individual values 4s are the foundational layer of Pokémon's hidden statistical architecture. Every Pokémon, at the moment it is generated by the game, is assigned a set of numbers between 0 and 31 for each core stat. These numbers cannot be changed through normal play in the games that introduce them. They cannot be seen without external tools or, in later generations, specific NPC interactions. They affect every calculation the stat participates in, scaling upward as the Pokémon levels. The difference between a Pokémon with an IV of 0 and one with an IV of 31 at level 100 can be dozens of points across multiple stats, significant margins in competitive battles, where the smallest advantages compound across multiple turns. In Generation 1, these values worked differently. They were called Stat Experience, or Stat Exp, sometimes retrospectively called DV's determinant values. They were 4-bit numbers, with values from 0 to 15, rather than 5-bit 0 to 31 ranges. They were stored as pairs in single bytes of game memory, with attack and defense sharing a byte, speed and special sharing a byte. The perfect stat Pokemon in Generation 1 had a DV of 15 in every stat. What Generation 1 never told you was that these values had additional consequences. Shininess, in the generation before shininess officially existed, was technically present in the game's underlying logic. A Pokemon with a special DV of 10, attack DV of 2, defense DV of 10, and speed DV of 10 carried the numerical configuration that, when shiny Pokemon became a formal mechanic in Gold and Silver, would be read as the shiny variant. This means that if you transferred a Pokemon from Generation 1 to Generation 2 with this specific DV configuration, it would arrive in Gold or Silver as a shiny. Most players never had this combination by chance. Anyone who bred specifically for perfect stats, maximizing the special DV at 15, in particular, was selecting against it. The intersection of people who both transferred Pokemon from Generation 1 and happened to have a shiny DV combination was vanishingly small. Effort values EVs in modern terminology. StatExp in the original games are distinct from IVs and work through a different mechanism. Every Pokemon defeated in battle leaves behind an invisible number that contributes to the winner's stats. In the original games, this system was entirely invisible and entirely untethered from any in-game explanation. You battled Pokemon, and their defeat added values to your Pokemon's statistical profile through a mechanism no documentation acknowledged. Players who fought dozens of battles with a Pokemon against specific opponents were building statistical advantages they couldn't see, quantify, or control. Working through a system the game declined to inform them existed. The consequence was outcomes that felt random. Two players could raise seemingly identical Pokemon through similar levels and end up with visibly different stat totals. Players who ground through the Elite Four multiple times had Pokemon with different profiles than players who completed the story and stopped. Nobody could explain why. The invisibility of EV accumulation meant that player choices were affecting the game in unacknowledged ways, producing results that were real and meaningful and entirely inexplicable through the information the games provided. Modern Pokemon added the ability to see EVs, to track which Pokemon contribute them in what quantities, to manage EV training towards specific targets, and eventually to clear accumulated EVs through items and activities that let players reset their distribution. The invisible system was made legible, then controllable. The competitive scene that developed around precisely managing it represents perhaps the greatest distance between how the franchise presents itself to new players and what its experienced practitioners understand it to require. Shiny Pokemon, as mentioned in the previous section's context, were not an originally planned feature. The first formal appearance of shininess as a mechanic was the red Gyarados encountered at the Lake of Rage in Gold and Silver, a scripted encounter that introduced the concept through gameplay before players had any framework for understanding what had happened. The origin of the system was a byproduct of how the developers implemented color differentiation under the Game Boy Color's expanded palette. They discovered they could swap a Pokemon's color data, the palette values assigned to each layer of the sprite, at minimal additional memory cost. Swapping colors produced alternate colored versions of existing sprites without requiring new sprite art. The alternate colors were implemented across the entire roster, given a specific statistical trigger, those DV values, and released into the world as an additional layer of discovery and rarity. The probability calculation is one of the franchise's most frequently cited statistics. 1 in 8,192 encounters produces a shiny Pokemon in generations 2 through 5. This is not an obviously memorable or particularly elegant number. It derives from the DV trigger condition and the 4-bit DV range. The chance of any given Pokemon having the specific pattern of values that registered as shiny under the Gen 2 calculation was approximately 1 in 8,192. Later generations moved the rate to 1 in 4,096 as a quality-of-life adjustment. Various items, abilities, and game modes have modified the probability further. The Masuda method breeding Pokemon from games with different region settings applies a multiplier that dramatically improves shiny odds, a mechanic named after the game's lead composer and director because he announced it through interviews rather than in-game documentation. The friendship system in Generation 2 was the franchise's first formal implementation of an emotional bond statistic, and its effects were more sweeping than most players realized. Friendship determined the evolution of Togepi into Togetic, Eevee into Espeon or Umbreon, Golbat into Crobat, Chansey into Blissey, and several other Pokémon introduced with friendship-based evolution in Gold and Silver. Raising friendship required walking with your Pokémon, using them in battles, applying certain items, having them groomed, and avoiding letting them faint. Lowering friendship required the latter. A Pokémon that faints frequently, held in a box without use, or given bitter-tasting herbal medicines that improve health but reduce affection, will remain at low friendship indefinitely. The 256-step walk cycle is a technical detail embedded in how friendship is calculated. The game runs its friendship update code at every 256-step interval, a consequence of how it tracks movement in memory, counting individual steps against a variable that resets at 256 and triggers the friendship calculation on reset. This means that walking exactly 256 steps, or multiples thereof, produces friendship gains most efficiently if you're trying to optimize the process. Players who didn't know this were gaining friendship at the same overall rate, but through less efficient intervals. The mechanic was never explained anywhere in the game. The nature system, introduced in Generation 3, added a personality modifier to the base stat formula, a percentage boost to one stat, and a corresponding reduction in another. 25 natures exist. The beneficial natures align the boost with a high-value stat given the Pokémon's intended role, and the penalty with a stat the Pokémon doesn't rely on. The worst-case scenario is a nature that both penalizes a primary stat and boosts a stat, with no practical value for that Pokémon. The best-case scenario, a nature that boosts the primary offensive stat with a penalty to a physical or special defense stat in a glass cannon Pokémon, creates meaningful upside. The system added depth to team building that required planning from the moment a Pokémon was encountered or hatched, not as an afterthought at higher levels. Breeding, introduced in Gold and Silver through the Daycare Center, created the infrastructure for controlled Pokémon production that competitive play eventually formalized. Place 2 compatible Pokémon in the daycare and walk with them. After a certain number of steps, an egg will appear. The egg hatches into a first-stage Pokémon of the mother's species. The hatched Pokémon inherits statistical properties from its parents in ways the game initially described incompletely. IVs pass through inheritance at random, with certain mechanics guaranteeing specific IV inheritance when appropriate items are held. The hatched Pokémon can inherit the father's move pool, including egg moves, moves that the hatched Pokémon couldn't learn through normal level up or TM, but that the father had access to through his own training or species move pool. This move inheritance created access to movesets that otherwise wouldn't be possible. The Pokerus is the most benign disease the franchise has ever designed and the most frequently misunderstood positive status in the games. A very small number of wild Pokémon carry Pokerus. The probability is approximately 1 in 21,000 encounters, making it significantly rarer than a standard shiny encounter. A Pokémon infected with Pokerus displays a small icon indicating its status and, during the period of active infection, gains double the normal EV yield from every battle. The infection spreads to adjacent party members over time. After a period of active infection, the Pokerus becomes dormant, displayed differently on the status screen, and the Pokémon becomes immune to reinfection but retains the EV doubling effect as a permanent benefit. Many players who contracted Pokerus either didn't know what it was, mistook the status icon for a negative condition, or cured it through a Pokémon Center visit, which, counterintuitively, doesn't remove Pokerus, as it isn't classified as a disease the center treats. Understanding Pokerus required external knowledge the game didn't provide, and distinguishing it from something to be worried about. Part 8. The card game's hidden history misprints, urban legends, and the rarest cardboard on Earth. The Pokémon trading card game launched in Japan in October 1996, 8 months after the video games arrived. Its North American release came in 1998, distributed by Wizards of the Coast, the same company publishing Magic: The Gathering, whose distribution infrastructure and retail relationships gave Pokémon cards access to markets and shelf space that would have otherwise taken years to build. Within 18 months of the North American launch, Pokémon cards were the most sought-after children's collectible in the country. Supply chains collapsed under demand that nobody had projected. Card shops in suburban strip malls had waiting lists for booster boxes. Elementary school playgrounds had active markets. Parents were waking up at 4 a.m. to line up outside toy stores before Saturday openings. This environment produced an extraordinary volume of rumors about particular cards, particular rarities, particular conditions that supposedly made a given card enormously valuable or gave it special gameplay properties. Some of these rumors had a basis in reality. Others were pure playground mythology that spread with the particular confidence that only completely fabricated information achieves when children are the primary transmission vector. Separating the genuine oddities from the invented ones requires understanding what the card production process actually looked like during the Wizards of the Coast era. The pre-release Raichu is the card that sits at the boundary between documented fact and genuine historical uncertainty. During the production run of the base set's Jungle print, the first official set expansion after base set Wizards of the Coast was preparing promotional pre-release cards intended to be distributed to tournament participants before the set's official launch. Pre-release cards receive a distinctive stamp, usually the word pre-release, printed diagonally across the card's face in black text, identifying them as advance copies rather than retail product. The intended pre-release card for the Jungle set was Clefable. The rumor, and it has existed in collector communities since the late 1990s, states that a small number of Raichu cards received the pre-release stamp intended for Clefable through a production line error. Raichu was not in the Jungle set. A Raichu card with a pre-release stamp would be a base set Raichu from a printing batch preceding Jungle set production that somehow passed through the stamping process at the wrong moment. Estimates of how many exist range from a small handful to somewhere in the dozens, depending on the account. Multiple people have claimed ownership. Wizards of the Coast, when pressed in public communications during the original collecting era, gave statements that neither confirmed nor denied the existence of genuine copies. Subsequent authentication attempts have produced conflicting results. The community today is divided into three roughly equal groups. Those who believe genuine pre-release Raikus exist in small numbers in private collections. Those who believe all claimed copies are sophisticated fakes produced during an era when collector interest was high enough to make forgery worthwhile. And those who believe the story originated as a rumor, with no production event behind it at all. No certified genuine example has appeared at auction under conditions where the authentication would settle the question permanently. The pre-release Raichu remains unresolved. The shadowless base set cards are the most valuable normally occurring base set condition and the most frequently misidentified by casual sellers. Base set cards went through two distinct print runs with a meaningful visual difference. The first print run, called Shadowless by collectors, has the card's artwork on a white background that extends to the card edge without a drop shadow effect underneath the right side and bottom of the artwork frame. The second and subsequent print runs added a shadow beneath the artwork frame, giving it the appearance of sitting above the card surface. Shadowless cards were produced in smaller quantities than the with shadow printings because the art correction was made relatively early in the production run. They are not rare in the sense of being difficult to find. Millions exist, but they are rarer than the common version, and in significantly higher demand among collectors who want complete base set conditions. The no rarity symbol cards add a further layer to base set collecting complexity. The base set's first Japanese print run from Bandai did not include the rarity symbols, the circle, diamond, and star icons that indicate common, uncommon, and rare on the cards. When the set was printed for export and for the Western market, rarity symbols were added. But a portion of the early Wizards of the Coast English print run was produced from plates that hadn't yet incorporated the rarity symbols, producing English language cards without the expected bottom right corner symbol. These cards were distributed in early booster packs and are meaningfully rarer than the standard version of the same cards. The Red Cheeks Pikachu is a collector milestone that many newer collectors don't know exists. Two base set Pikachu printings differ in a subtle but clearly visible detail. One features Pikachu's cheek circles rendered in a vivid red, while the other renders them in yellow, matching the Pokemon's standard coloring. The Red Cheeks version was the original print. The change to yellow was made after an art review, presumably because yellow cheeks better matched the established visual design. Red Cheeks Pikachus are rarer than yellow and command significant premiums among collectors seeking condition-specific, base-set completeness. The Ancient Mew promotional card, distributed in conjunction with the second Pokémon movie, has one of the stranger histories in the card game's legal record. The card was produced as a movie promo, distributed in theaters with admission to Pokémon, the movie, 2000, and printed in a runic script that was deliberately unreadable by anyone unfamiliar with the obscure script system used. The aesthetic intent was to make the card feel ancient and mysterious, consistent with its narrative role in the film. The problem was that the card could be translated. The script was based on a modified Futhark runic alphabet, not an invented one, and in certain competitive formats, the card's translated text created mechanical interactions that tournament organizers deemed unbalanced. The card was officially banned from sanctioned competitive play relatively quickly, making it a promotional collectible rather than a playable card in any official context. The Trainer No, or Trainer No, 1 trophy cards exist in quantities so limited that their combined total would fit comfortably in a single binder. These tournament champion trophies were produced for specific competitions in the earliest years of organized play, printed in very small numbers, sometimes fewer than 10 for a given tournament, and given to the winners as physical artifacts of their achievement. Most are in private collections. Their auction appearances are rare enough to generate significant media attention within collector communities. They represent the intersection of gameplay, achievement, and object scarcity that produces the highest valuations in the entire hobby. The fossil art misprint on the Dragonite card produced a particular category of collector interest. A very small number of base-set Dragonite cards received an image used for a different Pokémon. The visual assets for 2 cards were transposed during a production step. The error was caught and corrected rapidly, making the misprint cards among the rarest in the set. Misprints of various kinds exist throughout the earliest Wizards print runs. Cards with the wrong energy symbol, cards with type misattributions, cards where the artwork was inadvertently flipped horizontally. Each one represents a moment where the production process failed in a visible way and was corrected quickly enough that the failure version became unusual. The Unlimited and First Edition distinction produces the most value divergence for most base set cards. First Edition cards from the first complete print run released to the market carry a small stamp on the left side of the card's artwork frame that reads First Edition with a small globe emblem. All subsequent print runs of the same cards lack this stamp. The difference in value between a First Edition holographic Charizard and an Unlimited holographic Charizard, both in high condition, can be significant multiples. Graded copies of the First Edition holographic Charizard have sold at auction for sums that place them among the most valuable trading card items in the hobby's history, occasionally surpassing sports cards that had previously set category records. Part 9. What almost existed, scrap systems, and the features that didn't make it. Game Freak's development process is characterized by a willingness to pursue ideas far past the concept stage, before concluding that they don't serve the final product. The company has scrapped features that were functionally complete, removed Pokémon that had finished designs, and cut story content that was fully written. The traces left by these removals in code, in development documentation, in data mined from finished cartridges, give the franchise's history a parallel dimension where Pokémon turned out differently. Pokémon Stadium, on the Nintendo 64, began its life as a debugging tool. When the Game Boy Pokémon games were in development, Game Freak needed a way to visualize what the Pokémon looked like outside the limitations of the Game Boy's display, to inspect the 3D models that existed in a conceptual space and see how they moved, how their animations read, how they occupied three-dimensional space in the way that the Game Boy couldn't render. The N64 hardware could accommodate this visualization comfortably. The debugging tool ran. Programmers, artists, and designers gathered around the screen, and the response to what they saw fully articulated Pokémon models battling in rendered 3D space was unanimous enough that the tool's purpose shifted. Stadium became a product because everyone who watched the debug mode run wanted to own it. The final game preserves this origin. It remains something closer to a showcase than a narrative game, an expression of what these creatures looked like when the hardware was powerful enough to show them properly. The original plan for what became the Safari Zone mechanic in Generation 1 reportedly had a timer rather than a step counter. Players would have been given a countdown clock and could attempt to catch whatever Pokémon they could reach before time expired. The mechanic would have created a pressure dynamic, a race against the clock through the grass and water of the Safari Zone, trying to position yourself near whatever you most wanted to catch before your time ran out. Developers concluded that a step counter was easier to track, more transparent to the player, and created a different kind of challenge, not speed, but efficiency of movement and resource use. The resulting mechanic, throwing bait and rocks instead of battling, managing a step budget, turned out to have its own counterintuitive depths that players spent years trying to optimize. The Safari Zone's throw bait to attract, throw rock to anger system was never fully explained in-game, and the actual mathematical effects are different from what players assumed. Bait generally reduces catch rates, while rocks increase flee rates, making both throws counterproductive in specific ways that undermine most players' intuitions about what they should do. Pokémon Colosseum for the GameCube was originally designed with wild Pokémon encounters intact. The final game's defining mechanic, snagging shadow Pokémon from enemy trainers during battle, was not the original primary design. Prototypes and development documentation describe a system where players could encounter ordinary, wild Pokémon in addition to the shadow encounter system. The dual track was scrapped because it diluted the moral weight that the shadow system was designed to carry. Stealing Pokémon from other trainers is morally ambiguous in a way that catching wild Pokémon isn't, and the developers wanted to maintain focus on that moral ambiguity. Colosseum asks you to steal repeatedly, to take Pokémon from the trainers who have corrupted them, and then to perform the work of healing those Pokémon's corruption. Making you a Pokémon thief in a context where that theft is morally justified and emotionally redemptive required the wild encounter option to be removed. Otherwise, the player's relationship to Pokémon ownership became too similar to the standard experience to carry the intended weight. Pokémon XD, Gale of Darkness, extended the Colosseum design and added a purification system that was, in early builds, considerably darker than what shipped. The development documentation describes a mechanic where purified Pokémon could remember. Their shadow state could retain behavioral echoes of the corruption, even after successful purification. Specifically, there were plans for shadow memory to manifest as occasional disobedience or battle hesitation. A purified Pokémon that should follow your commands might, at low probability moments, freeze briefly or act independently in ways that recalled its previous state. The mechanic was removed before release because playtesters found it punishing in a way that felt unfair. Having a Pokémon you'd worked to heal continue to undermine, you felt like the game withholding the satisfaction that the healing process was supposed to provide. Pokémon Snap on the Nintendo 64 had a significantly more ambitious design than the game that shipped. The complete feature set, as documented through developer interviews and data mining of the released game, included camera lenses that players could swap between, zoom lenses for distant subjects, wide-angle lenses that captured more of the environment in a single frame, fisheye options for artistic distortion. The final game gave players a single fixed-lens camera with no options. Additionally, early builds had Lapras as a rideable platform that would carry the player slowly through water environments, getting close to aquatic Pokémon in ways the 01 research vehicle couldn't accomplish. The removal of both features, the lens options and the Lapras ride, simplified the gameplay considerably, removing the creative and positional choices that would have made the photography system genuinely complex. New Pokémon Snap, released in 2021 for the Nintendo Switch, implemented both concepts. Selectable effects that alter how the frame captures subjects, and water traversal mechanics that allow close approach to aquatic encounters. The original's cut features lived in development documentation for 23 years before appearing in the sequel. Gold and Silver contain an unused Safari Zone hidden in the game's map data. The Johto games don't feature a Safari Zone in their storyline. No zone exists in the playable Johto region. Players who used cheat devices or memory editing tools to access unenumerated map addresses found a fully mapped Safari Zone, complete floor tiles, boundary walls, proper water placement, functioning map header data. The zone was designed, built, placed in the game's map index, and then removed from the location data that would have made it accessible through normal navigation. Why it was cut is undocumented. Heart Gold and Soul Silver. The 2009 remakes of Gold and Silver included a full safari zone in Johto, the Pal Park area, repurposed for the remakes region, almost as if Game Freak was revisiting the decision made a decade earlier. The Trick House in Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire was originally planned as a much more ambitious structure. Development notes describe a sprawling, multi-level puzzle dungeon with trainers embedded throughout, new layers of challenge, unlocking progressively, and a final encounter with the Trick Master himself, commanding a full Pokémon team. Space constraints on the Game Boy Advance cartridge reduced the Trick House to its released form. A compact series of puzzle rooms with no trainer battles, and a Trick Master who serves as a host rather than an opponent. Data miners examining the Ruby and Sapphire cartridges found incomplete data referencing the Trick Master's planned Pokémon team, sprite references, and incomplete stat blocks for creatures that would have composed his party. The team was removed, the host remained. The game file still gestures toward what the Trick Master was originally going to be. The Battle Tower in Pokémon Crystal was the prototype for the competitive challenge facilities that became one of the franchise's defining post-game elements. The Battle Tower concept expanded over subsequent generations into the Battle Frontier of Emerald, widely considered among the franchise's greatest post-game offerings and the various challenge facilities of later games. The Crystal Battle Tower's original design was more ambitious. Early documentation describes an island dedicated entirely to competitive challenge, with multiple facilities rather than a single tower structure, distinct environments serving different competitive formats, and NPC characters with personalities sophisticated enough to rival the depth of gym leaders. Cartridge Space collapsed this vision into the single tower format that shipped. The Frontier concept that appeared in Emerald 3 games later may have been the eventual realization of what Crystal was originally trying to build. Black and White planned a gym system that changed based on time of day. Early development documents describe each gym having a morning, afternoon, and evening configuration, different trainers, different puzzle layouts, different dialogue from the gym leader themselves. The idea was both to reward players who challenged gyms multiple times and to make the gym experience feel embedded in a world that operated continuously, rather than freezing when the player wasn't present. The mechanic was removed before shipping, almost certainly because the balance work required for 3 complete versions of 8 different gyms exceeded what the development timeline allowed. Sword and Shield implemented version-exclusive gyms, different gyms available in each version of the paired games, which preserved the idea of multiple gym configurations while solving the balance problem through the simpler mechanism of making each version's configuration fixed. Part 10. The anime's hidden architecture scripts that weren't used, and characters who almost were different. The Pokémon anime is unusual in children's television history for sustaining a single narrative across more than 1,000 episodes through 3 decades of production, across multiple production studios, with an evolving cast of characters and constant format revision. What makes it more unusual is how much of that continuity was improvised. Major decisions were reversed by external pressure. Characters were designed for limited appearances and ran for years because audiences responded to them. Whole seasons were planned with different protagonists that never materialized. The anime as it exists is the product of 1,000 course corrections applied to a ship that was being built while it sailed. Ash Ketchum was originally supposed to win the Indigo League. The scripts for the final rounds of the tournament were drafted, with Ash defeating his opponents in sequence, reaching the championship match, and winning. The decision was reversed at an executive level, over the objection of some writers, on the grounds that Ash becoming champion would require either a new narrative direction or ending the show, that his journey had commercial value precisely because it was ongoing, and a victory would complicate that. The substitute narrative, Ash losing to Richie, a rival introduced specifically for the tournament, with no prior appearance required, writing a character plausible enough to beat the protagonist in ways audiences could accept. The loss defined Ash's character for 25 years of subsequent storytelling. He didn't win a regional championship until well into the Sun and Moon era, and he didn't become world champion until 2023. The decision to make him lose to Richie in 1998 shaped the entire arc. Clefairy was the designated anime mascot until extremely close to the show's launch. The companion manga, Pokémon Pocket Monsters, starred a Clefairy as the protagonist's partner, and early production materials for the anime treated this as the established configuration. Pikachu's selection over Clefairy was driven by a combination of market testing and visual pragmatics. Pikachu's design appealed evenly across gender demographics in the tested sample groups, while Clefairy tested with a slight skew toward female respondents. Electric attacks generated more visually dynamic promotional material than normal-type movesets, and Pikachu's distinctive yellow coloration read better against the dark backgrounds of printed promotional materials. The switch was made late enough in pre-production that the companion manga's continued use of Clefairy created a permanent divergence between the anime's chosen mascot and the manga's, a split that was never reconciled. Brock was designed for a limited early appearance. The original production plan described Ash's companions rotating regularly as he moved through different regions, with regional gym leaders joining briefly and passing the companion role to subsequent figures. Brock, as the first gym leader Ash encounters who would feasibly accompany him, was one of several candidates for the rotating companion slot. Fan response to his personality, his combination of practical competence, genuine warmth, self-aware comedy, and persistent romantic ineffectiveness was strong enough that the rotation concept was abandoned. Brock remained a main cast member through Kanto, was absent during the Orange Islands, and was brought back for Johto after test audiences found his replacement, Tracy Sketchit, insufficiently compelling. Tracy is quietly remarkable as a character who existed, partly because the production was testing whether the show could survive without Brock, and concluded that it couldn't. Misty was almost the show's main character. Pre-production pitches that circulated before the final format was locked described the female companion as the narrative's primary protagonist, the character who caught and battled Pokémon, while the male character played a secondary role. This configuration was rejected by network executives, who believed a male protagonist would perform better commercially in the international markets the franchise was targeting, particularly North America. The decision preserved the gender dynamic conventional in children's adventure programming of that era, and gave Ash the show. Misty became the supporting character who, within the frame available to her, developed a personality specific enough that fan communities have maintained her popularity for decades after her removal from the main cast. James from Team Rocket has a character detail written into his background early in the series, and then almost entirely forgotten by the production in subsequent years. He is from an extraordinarily wealthy family. His family home, when depicted in the episode where this backstory is revealed, is enormous. His family employs staff. They have expectations for James that he has comprehensively failed to meet by joining a criminal organization as a low-ranking operative. The early writers were interested in this contrast, James existing simultaneously as a figure of absurd comic incompetence and as someone whose social position and material circumstances were vastly better than his current situation, would suggest. Episodes that returned to this backstory showed the tension between what his family expected and what he had chosen. The production gradually abandoned the theme, using it occasionally for single-episode comedy plots and then essentially forgetting it had established it. Ash's Charizard disobedience arc is the anime's longest, deliberately sustained character tension. Charmander joined the team as an abandoned Pokémon whose previous trainer had left it to die in the rain. The emotional weight of that backstory established Charmander as one of the show's most sympathetic early Pokémon. As it evolved, through Charmeleon to Charizard, its attitude toward Ash transformed from trust to contempt, not because of any single event, but through a gradual process connected to the Pokémon's growing power and Ash's limitations as a trainer. Charizard during its disobedience phase would refuse commands, sleep during battles, and occasionally act against Ash's interests. The original plan was for this to be the Pokémon's permanent state, a recurring gag about the limits of Pokémon training as an expression of will rather than relationship. Fan response shifted the plan. Viewers wanted the relationship to resolve, and the production provided the arc that allowed it through a specific challenge, a moment of mutual vulnerability, a trust re-established under conditions that gave Charizard reason to care about the outcome. The episode where Charizard chooses to stay awake and fight for Ash during the Pokémon League is specifically designed to invert every element of the disobedience arc with deliberate emotional efficiency. Meowth's decision to learn human speech is established as his backstory within the anime. He taught himself by watching humans and practicing obsessively, motivated by affection for a Meowth who preferred human company to his own. This backstory gives him his distinctiveness in the series, the only Pokémon who regularly communicates in full grammatical sentences. The Japanese voice actress, Inuko Inuyama, developed a specific vocal texture for the character that wasn't specified in any script direction, a street-inflected, slightly rough delivery that gave Meowth the quality of someone performing self-possession while carrying real insecurity underneath. Writers noticed that this unscripted texture created comedy and character depth that the written lines alone didn't generate, and began writing to it explicitly, giving Meowth more material that could exploit the contrast between his verbal fluency and his emotional fragility. The episode Bye Bye Butterfree exists in a draft that was significantly darker than what aired. Early versions of the script had Butterfree departing without return, the Pokémon simply leaving and the narrative acknowledging that it wouldn't be seen again, with a more openly grief-stricken response from Ash. The purple coloring of the female Butterfree that Ash's Butterfree pursues was designed specifically to create visual distinction before shiny Pokémon existed as a formal mechanic, giving the other Butterfree a unique appearance without any game system basis for it. The final episode softened the farewell into the bittersweet configuration. It became still emotional, still significant, but wrapped in enough hope that it didn't constitute the first genuinely tragic episode of the series. Giovanni's planned role in the Indigo arc included a personal confrontation with Ash that was written into drafts and then removed before production. The concept positioned Giovanni as a recurring antagonist who would have increasingly direct interest in the protagonist, making the conflict between Team Rocket and Ash personal at the organizational level rather than incidental. The decision to keep Giovanni distant, a shadowy authority figure who Jesse and James reported to, but who never engaged the children's adventure narrative, directly preserved his menace by keeping him abstract. Giovanni as an active antagonist required making him specific, and specificity would have reduced the particular quality of threat that his controlled remoteness created. Part 11. The myths that traveled through playgrounds, urban legends, and what was true about them. There was a specific epistemology that operated on elementary school playgrounds in the years between 1998 and 2002. Information about Pokémon moved through social networks that had no way to verify claims and every incentive to amplify them. A story that was exciting enough to repeat would travel across lunch tables, through recess conversations, between classes, to friends of friends of friends in other schools. By the time it arrived at its furthest point from its origin, it had often been transformed by the telephone game mechanics of oral transmission into something substantially different from what started it. Some of these stories had small nuclei of real information that the transmission process inflated. Others were invented whole cloth. The remarkable thing is how coherent they remained. False as they were, the playground myths about Pokémon had an internal logic that made them feel plausible to children who desperately wanted them to be true. Mew Under the Truck is the franchise's most iconic playground myth and has a real basis that makes it more interesting than a pure invention. The S. Anne is a luxury cruise ship that appears once in the storyline of Pokémon Red and Blue and then disappears. Once you've boarded it, used HM1 cut to remove the tree blocking your path and sailed it away. The ship never returns. It is permanently gone. This creates a kind of narrative loss, something present and then absent, that playground mythology filled with compensatory discovery stories. The truck appeared, a large, immovable object near the ship's dock in Vermilion City, sitting on a strip of water accessible by surfing, unmovable and apparently purposeless. Purposeless objects in a game built around discoverable secrets implied hidden content. A Pokémon Under the Truck Mew, specifically, the franchise's most legendarily hidden creature, became the answer to why the truck was there. The truck contained no Pokémon. It has no interactive function. It exists as a piece of environment dressing that the game's map designers placed without any hidden mechanic attached. The item finder doesn't register anything near it. No NPC references it. No game documentation acknowledges it. The truck is there because trucks appear in port environments, and the map designer placed it without intending it to carry any meaning. Pokémon Sun and Moon contain a parked truck near the harbor of a coastal city that serves no gameplay purpose. It is Game Freak, 30 years after the Vermilion City truck, acknowledging the myth with the particular affection of people who created something by accident and watched it become legendary. The missing no origin, as the spirit of a dead Pokémon, was the most emotionally resonant, false explanation for the creature, and spread with impressive persistence. Children encountering a glitched entity, something that clearly wasn't designed as part of the normal experience, something that behaved differently from every Pokémon they'd ever encountered, something that looked wrong in a way they couldn't immediately account for, reached for a narrative explanation, and the one that arrived was death. Missing No was the ghost of a Pokémon that had died in your game. Missing No was a trainer's lost Pokémon wandering after its trainer's death. Missing No was the consciousness of a deleted save file, returned from whatever void held deleted data. None of these were true. Missing No was a placeholder that emerged from empty index slots. But the emotional power of the death narratives explains why they spread. They gave Missing No meaning, consistent with the specific quality of wrongness it seemed to have. Pokégods were the playground mythology's most elaborate product. The term described a class of supposedly hidden Pokémon, beyond the official 151, beyond even Mew, obtainable through specific sequences of actions that could only be learned through sources of claimed authority. Pikablue was the most persistent of these, an alleged evolved form of Pikachu, available through a sequence involving the SS and specific item combinations. Pikablue was Marill, a fairy blue round creature that appeared in the theatrical short preceding the first Pokémon film in Japan. Advanced screenings and word-of-mouth descriptions of the film reached American fan communities before the film's US release, and the creature's existence, real but unexplained, became the seed for the Pikablue mythology. When Marill was officially revealed as a genuine upcoming Pokémon before Gold and Silver, children who had heard about Pikablue felt retroactively correct. The name was wrong. The availability mechanism was invented. But the creature was real. Chirolte was a claimed evolution of Charizard. Pokémon like Rainer and Mist were described as alternate evolutions of Eevee, accessible through specific item combinations in games before any such combinations existed. Tricket was supposedly a bug-type legendary. Magazine scans were manufactured and passed around as evidence. The magazines in question were either entirely fabricated or modified from real publications through methods available to anyone with scissors, tape, and access to a photocopier. Players who arrived at their local game retailer requesting confirmation of Pikablue's availability from store employees received responses ranging from sympathetic ignorance to outright confirmation employees who didn't want to disappoint children, and who sometimes knew as little as the children asking. The Mirage Island in Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire is real. This is the important distinction from other playground myths. Mirage Island genuinely exists in the game, generates on the world map, and can be visited. The mechanism that determines its visibility is what places it in the mythology territory. A random number between 0 and 65,535 is generated by the game each day. Simultaneously, the game generates a random value for the lead Pokémon in your party, also between 0 and 65,535. If these two numbers match a probability of approximately 1 in 65,536, Mirage Island appears on the map, accessible by surfing on the river near Passifidlog town. An NPC in Passifidlog watches for the island and tells you if it's visible on any given day. For most players across most playthroughs, he never has good news. Mirage Island contains wild Wynaut and the rare Lychee Berry, which other mechanics in the game require to breed specific move sets. Its inaccessibility through normal play made it functionally legendary for a generation of players who never encountered it legitimately. Emulators and ROM hacking tools eventually made it trivially accessible, which is how its contents became documented. But the experience of playing Ruby or Sapphire on original hardware visiting Pasifidlog Town repeatedly, watching the NPC respond with the same negative answer hundreds of times. That experience produced genuine uncertainty about whether the island existed at all. The Lavender Town Syndrome stories spread after 2010 demonstrates how internet distribution amplified the reach and credibility of playground mythology for a generation that had aged out of playgrounds. The story circulated through gaming forums, creepypasta repositories, and eventually YouTube commentary channels. Its detail was sufficient to create superficial plausibility. It named dates, cited supposed medical documentation, described specific audiological mechanisms. None of it was documented. No archive contains the health emergency it described. The story worked because Lavender Town's real atmosphere, genuinely unnerving chiptune composition, real design, intent to signal that the player had entered somewhere different, provided an authentic emotional experience that the invented explanation fit convincingly. The missing no file. Corruption myth belongs in this section because it had partial truth that made complete untruth credible. Missing no itself does not corrupt save files under normal encounter conditions. Players who caught it, used it in battle, then saved their games, did not lose their saves to corruption. This was documented through play in numbers large enough to be reliable. What could corrupt saves were other placeholder entities in the same index space. M and certain numbered glitch Pokemon behaved differently than Missing No and had different memory effects when saved. The corruption stories, from children who claimed Missing No, had destroyed their games likely reflected encounters with those other entities, or reflected the natural corruption of aging. Game Boy cartridges' internal save batteries, a hardware failure that required no glitch to cause. The truck in Sun and Moon isn't the only evidence that Game Freak tracks its own mythology. The Glitch City accessibility in Fire Red and Leaf Green, the remakes of the original games, is blocked. The specific tile sequence that produced the Cinnabar Island coastline glitch doesn't function the same way in the remakes because the underlying memory architecture changed. The Old Man in Viridian City demonstrates catching in the remakes, but the demonstration doesn't overwrite memory in the same location. Missing No cannot be encountered through the same method in the remakes. Game Freak sealed the room that Legend was generated in. Whether they did this to protect data integrity, or as a specific creative decision to prevent the mythology from reproducing in new hardware, the effect is the same. Certain specific playground myths can only be experienced now through original hardware, preserved cartridges, and the particular conditions of 1996. Part 12. The Modern Archive: What Data Miners Found and What the Franchise Left Unfinished. The Internet transformed Pokemon fan archaeology. The playground mythology era required physical proximity and oral transmission, which constrained how far and how accurately information traveled. The data mining era required only a ROM file, a hex editor, and the patience to read machine code resources that were available to anyone with a computer, anywhere in the world, at any time. The result was systematic excavation of every Pokemon game that had been released, conducted by communities whose collective knowledge of the game's code bases grew more comprehensive with every generation. The Nintendo GigaLeak of 2020 exposed internal development materials from across Nintendo's history, including Pokemon content that had never been intended for public access. The leak occurred when a large collection of files was extracted from Nintendo's internal servers and distributed online. Among the materials were development builds of Pokemon games at various stages of production, internal design documentation, art assets in states between initial sketch and final polish, and code comments left by developers that offered unprecedented transparency into the decision-making process during development. Diamond and Pearl development materials in the GigaLeak included Pokemon designs in intermediate states. The Infernape line, the Fire-type starter evolutionary sequence for the Sinnoh region, appeared in earlier iterations that suggested the design had evolved significantly between initial conception and final release. Particularly striking was the Glameow line, Purugly's ungainly proportions, which read in the finished game as deliberate subversion of the expectation that a cat evolution would be graceful. They were confirmed by the development materials to have been an intentional creative decision. The design was changed from the more conventionally elegant, intermediate version, specifically to produce the effect of frustrated expectation. The Eternal Flower Floette is the franchise's most prominent example of content that was promised by the game itself and never delivered. Pokémon X and Y, released in 2013, feature a storyline involving AZ, an ancient king whose grief over the death of his Floette companion during a great war motivated him to construct a weapon powered by Pokémon Life Force. AZ's Floette is visually distinct from standard Floette. It carries an eternal flower not found on any normally obtainable Floette. At the conclusion of X and Y's story, AZ and his Floette are reunited. An NPC in the game refers specifically to AZ's Floette and states that the player may obtain one in the future. That future did not arrive in any mainline Pokémon game through the present day. AZ's Floette has not been distributed through any official event. Its data exists in the game files complete, functional, with its own Pokédex entry describing its unique history. That entry is accessible in the game's data, but is not available through the game's standard Pokédex interface because the Pokémon has never been legitimately obtained. Players who have accessed it through data mining know what it looks like, know its moves, know its backstory. The mechanic that was supposed to deliver it, whatever event distribution Game Freak had planned, never activated. AZ's Floette has become a kind of symbolic remainder, evidence of a promise made through a game's own narrative, by an NPC directing the player towards something that was supposed to come, still waiting for resolution that the franchise has not provided. The unused Arceus battle cry in Pokémon Diamond and Pearl is a small but telling detail about how the franchise manages its most narratively significant Pokémon. Arceus was introduced as the Pokémon universe's creator deity, the Alpha Pokémon, said in the lore, to have created the universe in the opening moments, before any of the other Pokémon existed. Its distribution was handled carefully. Arceus was not available through normal gameplay in Diamond and Pearl. It required a Nintendo event item, the Azure Flute, which was developed for distribution and then never officially distributed. Players in the United States who attended Nintendo events in 2008 hoping to receive the Azure Flute were not given it. The item was pulled from the distribution plan before any events occurred. Inside the Diamond and Pearl game files, the Arceus cry existed, its audio data present, its battle animations programmed, its encounter flags ready to trigger. All of this was functional code for a Pokémon that the game refused to make available. Players who used Action Replay or similar external tools to input the Azure Flute into their games could trigger the event normally ascending Spear Pillar to a specific location, playing the flute, summoning Arceus through the programmed sequence. The event worked. The functionality was complete. It was removed from availability not because it didn't function, but because Game Freak made a distribution decision that preserved Arceus's rarity. Heart Gold and Soul Silver distributed Arceus through an event that unlocked the special Ruins of Alph sequence, the Sinjoh Ruins, a new area connecting Johto and Sinnoh that appeared only if an event Arceus was in the player's party. This represented the eventual realization of what the Diamond and Pearl event had been designed to create, delivered through a different game several years later to players who had continued with the franchise. The Azure Flute remains, to this day, an item that exists in Diamond and Pearl's code, functions correctly when input through external means, and was never officially given to any player. Pokémon Go launched in July 2016, and within days had more active users than Twitter. The game's server infrastructure was not designed for the scale of engagement that materialized. In many regions, the servers were functionally unusable for the first several weeks because the volume of users exceeded all planning projections. The trading system, which seems structurally fundamental to any Pokémon experience, was not present at launch. Data miners who examined the early APK, the Android application package, found menu structures and interface elements for trading already embedded in the code. The trading system's absence wasn't because it hadn't been designed. It was removed from the launched version, almost certainly because server load from the active gameplay was already overwhelming, and adding the additional server transactions that a trading system would require was impractical under those conditions. Trading was officially added to Pokémon Go in June 2018, nearly 2 years after launch. The feature that the game's own code described as forthcoming was made available when the server infrastructure had been upgraded and stabilized enough to support it. Players who had been waiting since launch finally had the functionality that data miners had known was planned before the game had been released to the public. The wild area of Sword and Shield came with unused animation data discovered by data miners after the game's release. Specific Pokémon in the wild area had animation states that weren't activated in the released game. Movement cycles, suggesting pursuit behaviors, interaction animations for objects in the environment, following behaviors consistent with a companion Pokémon system. The animations were present in the release build. The code to trigger them under normal gameplay conditions was absent. The companion Pokémon mechanic, following Pokémon that walk beside the player on the overworld, appeared in the Isle of Armor DLC, released several months after the main game, retroactively activating functionality that had been dormant in code the players already owned. The sealed rooms in Pokémon Scarlet and Violet represent the franchise's most recent prominent example of inaccessible content. Multiple locations in the Paldea region contain structures or areas that are visually present on the map but inaccessible through normal navigation, gated by invisible collision walls or terrain features that prevent approach. Fan speculation during the months following release attributed these to planned DLC content that hadn't been released yet. Some of those assumptions proved correct when the Teal Mask and Indigo Disc DLC opened certain previously inaccessible areas. Others remain sealed with no announced content attached. Whether they represent cut content, future plans, or simple map design choices that created dead ends without DLC intent attached is undocumented. The Terrapagos reveal was the most significant piece of undistributed information hidden in the initial release of Scarlet and Violet. The Pokémon, which became central to the Indigo Disc DLC's story, had its data embedded in the base game's files before the DLC was released. Data miners identified its sprite, its type classification, and elements of its terrestrial mechanic before Game Freak had announced its existence publicly. The discovery created spoiler circulation that Game Freak had presumably tried to prevent by treating the DLC's central creature as a reveal. The data existing in the base game's files was a logistical necessity. DLC content on the Switch platform loads through the base application, but it meant that the franchise's most significant narrative surprise in those DLC packages could be known in advance by anyone who looked at the file. Write files. The Game Boy Color's memory limitations almost eliminated the day-night cycle from Gold and Silver. The feature tracking the real-world clock and adjusting which Pokémon were available, which events triggered, and which visual palette the environment used across morning, afternoon, evening, and night required storing multiple color palettes for every map in the game. The Game Boy Color had finite video memory, and the question of whether that memory could accommodate the cycle's requirements without unacceptable compromises to the rest of the game's visual quality generated extended internal debate during development. The team found compression approaches that made it viable without prohibitive sacrifice elsewhere. The day-night cycle shipped. Without it, the franchise's relationship with real-time would have been fundamentally different. The mechanics that subsequent games built on the cycle's foundation, scheduled events, time-locked evolution methods, day-specific encounters, season cycles, the real-time berry growing of Ruby and Sapphire, the tidal mechanics of certain coastal environments were all downstream consequences of a decision made under hardware pressure in 1999. Gold and Silver's day-night cycle influenced design thinking far beyond the Pokémon franchise. The Animal Crossing series, whose entire premise is built around real-time engagement with a persistent world that continues operating while the player is absent, draws on the same design understanding that the Pokémon cycle demonstrated. A game that knows what time it is when you turn it on is a game that can make time meaningful in ways that a static game cannot. The franchise approaches its 30th year, having produced more than 1,000 Pokémon, more than 100 main series episodes, more than a dozen core game entries, a mobile game with a documented history of transforming public behavior in urban environments, a trading card game still in active print with collector markets operating at unprecedented valuations, and a cultural presence in countries that had never heard of it before, the late 1990s. Underneath all of it is the machinery described across these 12 sections, the accidents and near misses, the scrap designs and cut features, the programming errors whose effects outlasted the corrections, the rumors that turned out to be real, and the promises that are still waiting to be kept. The franchise began because a boy in a suburb of Tokyo spent his childhood paying attention to things that had started to disappear and wanted to give that experience to other people. Whatever form it has taken since the competitive scenes and the collector markets and the animated films and the mobile phenomenon, the core of it is still that: discovery, connection, something worth sharing that you found in unexpected places. There are still things in these games that nobody has found. Code that hasn't been deciphered, events that were planned for distribution and never activated, questions about cut content that will only be answered when the right file surfaces from the right archive. The archaeology continues. The community that has been examining these cartridges for 3 decades hasn't stopped. Whatever brought you to this video, nostalgia, curiosity, the specific pleasure of finding out that the thing you love is stranger and deeper than you thought, I hope some small part of that original discovery feeling found its way through tonight. These games were built by people who cared about what they were making. The care is still visible in the details, including the ones that never made it out of the code. If you found something in here you'd never heard before, leave it in the comments. And if this is the kind of content you want to find when you open this channel, subscribing is the best way to make sure you don't miss what comes next. Take care of yourselves. Sleep well. Supplemental: 50 more fragments. The details that didn't fit anywhere else. There is a particular category of Pokémon fact that resists being organized into any neat section heading. Not quite origin, not quite glitch, not quite dark lore, not quite cut content, just a piece of the franchise's texture that, once you've encountered it, adds something to how you understand the whole. This section is dedicated to those fragments, 50 of them, some short, some that will take longer to do justice to, all of them real. The Pokémon Company did not exist when Red and Green shipped. Game Freak was the developer, and Nintendo handled publishing and distribution. The Pokémon Company, the joint organization that now manages the franchise across all its media forms, sharing ownership between Nintendo, Game Freak, and Creatures Inc., was incorporated in April 1998, 2 full years after the games first appeared. The franchise that existed before the company was incorporated is the same franchise, staffed largely by the same people, but with a different organizational structure underneath it. The company was created to consolidate control over the expanding IP, rather than to create the IP. Creatures Incorporated, the third partner in the franchise's corporate structure, handled the Game Boy cartridge's physical production and also developed the trading card game. Their involvement is why the card game carries DNA that connects to the main series games, rather than having been developed as a purely separate commercial product. Ken Sugimori has stated in interviews that he designed 151 Pokémon for the first generation with minimal reference material. No concept art briefs, no established visual style guide, no committee approval process for individual designs. He drew Pokémon on paper. They were iterated through conversation with Tajiri, and the ones that survived that process went into the game. The style that emerged from this informal process, naturalist-influenced, slightly eccentric, built on the idea that fictional creatures should feel like they belong to an internal biological logic, became the foundational aesthetic of the franchise and remained consistent enough across its subsequent designers that new Pokémon, designed by different people 30 years later, still read as part of the same visual world. The Pokémon Cry system in Generation 1 used a very small number of base sound samples that were modified through pitch and speed manipulation to produce the 151 distinct cries. This meant that many Pokémon cries were recognizable variations of each other. Players who listened carefully noticed the family resemblances. Pikachu and Raichu's cries are clearly modified versions of the same base sample. Golduck and Psyduck share an audible ancestor. The constraint was a hardware memory limitation. Storing 151 genuinely distinct audio samples would have consumed cartridge space needed for other content, and it produced an unintentional sonic coherence where the new exam, creature sounds felt like they inhabited a shared biological taxonomy. Later generations moved toward more genuinely distinct cries as cartridge and disk capacity increased. The type chart was designed differently from how it eventually appeared. In early development documentation, the Psychic type was specifically intended to have Ghost as a weakness, the supernatural versus the psychic, an opposition with thematic logic and game balance implications. Psychic in the first generation was the most statistically dominant type in the game. The highest stat trainers in the Elite Four used Psychic Pokémon. The rarest and most powerful wild encounters were Psychic types, and the overall stat distribution of the type was substantially more favorable than most others. Ghost as an effective counter would have provided meaningful checks on this dominance. Instead, Ghost ended up immune to Psychic, leaving the type with no practical weakness against opponents with any options. Dark type was introduced in Generation 2 specifically to address this imbalance. Dark was immune to Psychic and super effective against it. The type was designed from the beginning as the answer to a competitive problem that had made the original type chart unbalanced. Dark's own defensive profile was considered carefully as well, giving it weaknesses to Bug, and fighting two types with reasonably available attack options to prevent it from simply becoming the new dominant type through Psychic's weakness. The HM system, Hidden Machines, the items that taught Pokémon permanent field moves that couldn't be removed, was one of the franchise's most criticized design legacies from the player experience perspective. From the design perspective, it served a specific function, creating gates in the exploration space that required specific Pokémon with specific learned moves to pass. You needed a Pokémon that could cut to remove blocking trees. You needed a Pokémon that could surf to cross water. You needed a Pokémon that could strength to move boulders. This created a relationship between team composition and world navigation that made the Pokémon in your party feel like tools for engaging with the physical world, not just assets for battle. The criticism that HMs forced players to carry Pokémon specifically for field utility rather than battle effectiveness, creating team slots occupied by cut users who contributed nothing to combat, was accurate. The HM slave, as the community called it, was a Pokémon kept in the party specifically because it had been taught one or more necessary field moves and nothing else of use. Players who wanted optimal battle teams still needed these creatures in their party at various points. HMs were modified progressively through subsequent generations, with the most radical change coming in Sun and Moon, where HMs were entirely removed. Field navigation was instead handled through ride Pokémon creatures called using a pager item that appeared when their specific environment was required, didn't take up party slots, and didn't require TM or HM items. A player could surf across water without a water type in their party. They could climb cliffs without a Pokémon that knew rock climb. The separation of field navigation from party composition removed the HM slave problem entirely. Whether it was the right decision is still contested in fan communities that appreciated what the HM system contributed to the feeling of an interconnected world where team choices affected what you could access. Ditto's competitive role as a wild breeding partner, compatible with almost every Pokémon species to produce eggs of the partner's species, was not in the original design for breeding. Early Gold and Silver development had Ditto as one of several interchangeable partner options in the daycare. The decision to make Ditto the universal partner, compatible with species that couldn't breed with each other through any other pairing, was made because developers were concerned that certain single-gender or genderless Pokémon species would be too difficult to obtain specific offspring from without a universal partner option. Ditto's transformability made the universal compatibility narratively plausible within the game's fiction. A creature that can become anything, can reproduce with anything, and the decision solved a practical gameplay problem, while giving Ditto a defining mechanical role it has, maintained through every subsequent generation. The move Splash's origin as a mistranslation is one of the franchise's most repeated localization stories, and has the virtue of being actually true. In Japanese, the move is called Haneru, meaning hop or jump. The move description is accurately realized by its Japanese name. Magikarp flops desperately on land, trying to hop, achieving nothing. The English translation rendered it as splash, which carries the implication of water interaction and makes very little sense as the signature move of a creature that is famous for being unable to interact meaningfully with any environment it finds itself in. Hoppip, a grass-flying Pokémon with no relationship to water in any aspect of its design or lore, can learn Splash an absurdity that only makes sense if you know the original move name. The Marowak in the Kanto Pokédex has an average height of around 3 foot 3 inches and weighs roughly 99 pounds. Its hide is described as stone hard. It has evolved from Cubone, which wears the skull of its deceased mother as a helmet. This means that every adult Marowak is wearing the skull of a dead Marowak, their own mother integrated into their biology as their head casing. The skull that began as a grief expression item the child Pokémon chose to wear has, through evolution, fused into their physical form. They don't choose to carry the reminder of their dead mother. Their dead mother's skull has become the top of their body. The developmental arc from Cubone to Marowak is a transformation from voluntary mourning to involuntary biology. The franchise presents this without comment. Porygon's origin is a document in the history of human attempts to create artificial life within fictional frameworks. It is the first fully computer-generated Pokémon, not caught in the wild, not hatched from an egg, but assembled from programming code. The game establishes this by making it obtainable only through a coin exchange at the Celadon Game Corner. You don't find Porygon. You purchase it as a constructed object. Its type classification as normal reflects a design philosophy about what type designation means. A Pokémon made entirely of artificial code exists in the same categorical space as creatures that evolved in the natural world without supernatural or elemental affinity. Porygon is ordinary in type because there's nothing extraordinary about code, apparently. The franchise's creator deity Arceus is also normal type, which either suggests an elegant thematic symmetry or a coincidence that became retroactively interesting. The Team Rocket hideout beneath the Celadon Game Corner is reached through a secret entrance that the game never explicitly tells you about. You need to find a poster on the wall that, when interacted with, triggers a staircase. The staircase leads down into a multi-level criminal headquarters. The poster is findable because interacting with objects is habitual in exploration-based games, but there is no in-game dialogue that tells you where to look. This design philosophy, placing things in the world and expecting attentive players to find them, is consistent across the first generation and contributes to the sense that the game world rewards curiosity as a behavioral disposition. Lieutenant Surge, the electric-type gym leader in Vermilion City, is described in his dialogue as a soldier who survived combat by using his electric Pokémon as weapons in battle. He is one of the very few characters in the original games whose backstory implies actual wartime violence, people trying to kill each other using Pokémon in a theater of armed conflict. The implications of this are not developed in the game. No war is named. No political context is provided. Lieutenant Surge exists in the game as a single data point, suggesting that the world of Pokémon has had wars in which Pokémon were combatants alongside humans, that people died in these wars, that the survivors carry specific psychological marks from the experience. The cheerful adventure tone of the main game continues unaffected. The fishing rod system in Generation 1 has 3 tiers: Old Rod, Good Rod, Super Rod, obtainable at different points in the game, each accessing a different range of water-based Pokémon. The Old Rod catches only Magikarp. The Good Rod expands access to Poliwag, Goldeen, and a few others. The Super Rod opens the deepest encounters: Dratini in the Safari Zone, Gyarados by evolution, the full breadth of aquatic Pokémon. What the game doesn't tell you is that the probability of a response to the fishing attempt, the game's random check for whether the rod produces a bite, varies dramatically by rod tier. The Super Rod has a significantly lower bite probability than the Old Rod. Players using it correctly need more patience because the game generates more empty casts before the encounter. Most players assumed fishing worked consistently and attributed variance to bad luck. The Pokémon Tower in Lavender Town has a specific quantity of ghost encounters before the Sylph Scope is obtained. The ghost that appears, the one that requires the scope to be identified as the Marowak, appears in a fixed encounter position on a specific floor. Without the scope, the ghost presents as a type with no name and no visible form. If you attempt to catch it, the catch fails, regardless of Pokeball used. The game's encounter code checks for the ghost's ID and applies a flag that prevents successful capture. This is one of the very few wild Pokémon in Generation 1 that cannot be caught under any circumstances. The no-catch flag was applied intentionally to preserve the narrative. You are not supposed to be able to keep the dead mother's ghost in your collection. The Sylph Company building in Saffron City is the game's largest dungeon by room count. It has 11 floors, multiple locked areas requiring card keys found throughout the building, dozens of trainers, including rocket grunts and scientists, and culminates in a battle with Giovanni before he retreats from Saffron City permanently. The complete Sylph Company sequence takes significantly longer than any other dungeon in the game if fully explored. Players who tried to rush through it, reaching Giovanni's floor directly through teleporters rather than exploring, missed the card key that unlocked the floor with the Lapra's reward. The free Pokémon given by a frightened researcher who hands it over with the shaken sincerity of someone who survived something they didn't expect to. That Lapras can't be obtained any other way in a normal playthrough. The Elite Four's composition in Generation 1 was deliberately calibrated to test specific competitive competencies. Lorelei specializes in ice and water, requiring fire, electric, rock, or fighting responses to counter. Bruno uses fighting and rock types ironic, given the fighting type's weakness to psychic, and Bruno's own weakness to it. Agatha uses ghost and poison, requiring ground or psychic. Lance uses dragon types almost exclusively, which in Generation 1 had only one effective weakness: dragon moves, which had only Dragon Rage, a fixed damage move, and Twister. A normal damage option, meaning Lance's dragons were genuinely difficult to counter through type advantages. Ice became the practical answer because Ice is super effective against Dragon, but Ice-type moves and Pokémon capable of using them effectively were themselves not trivially available at that point in the game. The champion battle with Blue, your rival throughout the game, who has preceded you through the Elite Four and already received the champion designation before you arrived, is the one battle in the game that uses a team adaptive to your starter. Blue's team composition changes depending on which starter you chose at the beginning of the game. He has the starter Pokémon that would have been strong against yours, ensuring that his team's coverage addresses your central type advantage. This personalization is built into the game's code through a branching variable set at the moment of starter selection. Blue doesn't just respond to your team's current state, he has been calibrated against your starting choice from the opening moments of the game, a detail the game never mentions. The S. Anne's position in the game's code is permanent. The ship exists in the game's map data as a fixed location in Vermilion City Harbor. What changes is its accessibility. Once the in-game scripted event of your visit has concluded and the ship has sailed, the dock entrance is blocked by an NPC who tells you the ship has left. The ship is still there, physically, in the map data. It has not moved anywhere. The game's fiction describes it as departed. The map places it as present. Surfing from certain coastal angles produces unexpected interaction with the ship's external collision data. Players who found this through experimentation wondered whether the ship was intended to return in a different story context. It wasn't. The ship was never designed to move within the game's active data, only within the game's narrative. The Safari Zone's internal step counter counts each directional step as one unit toward the zone's exit limit. What the game doesn't communicate clearly is that running available through the bicycle does not make you exit faster relative to steps. You take more steps per unit of real time, but the counter increments normally per step. The strategic implication is that bicycling through the Safari Zone to cover more ground faster is more efficient than walking, because you're covering more map area per step used, not because steps are counted differently. The counterintuitive advice from competitive guides that bicycling in the Safari Zone uses your step budget more efficiently is true for the reason of information density per step, not any mechanical difference in how steps are counted. The Pokémon that appears as a statue at the entrance to the Pewter City Museum of Science is Kabutops. A fossilized Kabutops skeleton is one of the museum's primary exhibits, representing an ancient aquatic predator from a prehistoric era. The choice of Kabutops rather than Aerodactyl, the other fossil Pokémon, reflects a design decision about what kind of creature evokes prehistoric museum display most effectively. The posable skeleton of a bipedal, claw-bearing aquatic hunter reads as the kind of specimen a natural history museum would display in a central case. The museum itself, as a location, is one of the game's first examples of a setting that exists for world-building texture rather than gameplay function. You visit it. It tells you things about the world. You leave. No game mechanic requires you to have been there. The item finder works through a proximity detection system that checks a small radius around the player character for hidden item flags placed on specific tiles. Hidden items pickups, not associated with visible pokeballs, but simply coded into a tile as invisible, exist throughout Kanto in numbers that most first playthroughs never exhaust. The item finder buzzes more intensely as you move closer to a hidden item flag. Players who methodically walk the item finder through every tile of every area, listening for the detection, found healing items, rare berries, and, in a few locations, items of genuine competitive value that the game's normal progression didn't provide access to. This systematic approach was never described anywhere in-game. The tool was given to the player without instructions, and its optimal use required either systematic experimentation or external knowledge. The Cinnabar Island Pokemon Lab is one of the game's most narrative-rich optional locations. The scientists inside are conducting fossil revival research, the same research that produces Kabuto or Omanite when you bring the appropriate fossils to them. But additional dialogue throughout the lab describes genetic experiments of troubling implication. An entry log references a Mew sighting near a remote location and DNA retrieval from that sighting, followed by a series of experiments. A scientist tells you that a powerful Pokemon was created in the lab and escaped. The lab serves as the backstory for Mewtwo in the games, the creature who appears in the unknown dungeon after the main storyline concludes. The most powerful Pokemon available to catch in the game, the product of the experiments described in these logs. The first Pokemon movie later adapted this backstory into a full narrative. The movie made Mewtwo's origin explicit and emotional in ways the lab's brief text fragments only imply. Mewtwo's capture in the unknown dungeon, the cave accessible from Cerulean City post-Elite Four, is the game's final optional discovery. It is not required for completion. The Pokédex, at 150 Pokémon, does not include it. Finding the unknown dungeon requires knowing where it is, navigating its layout, and coming prepared for a battle with a creature whose statistics exceed those of the Elite Four's Pokémon substantially. The cave's atmosphere deliberately sparse, quietly unsettling, arriving in the post-game space where the main narrative has concluded frames Mewtwo as a discovery that the world kept for players who stayed curious after the credits. That curiosity, the impulse to check one more area, to speak to one more NPC, to cast the fishing rod in a place where fish shouldn't logically be, is the experience Satoshi Tajiri was trying to build from the beginning. The child in the suburb who crawled through undergrowth, looking for creatures that most people walked past without noticing, grew up and made a game that asked players to look more carefully, dig more thoroughly, and stay curious longer than the surface experience seemed to require. 30 years later, the communities still digging through these games are, at some level, doing what he intended. The franchise contains more than 10,000 individual pieces of documented content across its main series games alone. The data mining communities have found most of them. The ones that haven't been found yet are either encrypted beyond current tools in internal archives that haven't been leaked, or simply haven't been looked at carefully enough. All three categories almost certainly contain something worth knowing. That's the nature of a world built on discovery. There's always something else to find. Thank you for spending this time with these facts and stories. If something in here genuinely surprised you, I would actually love to know which one. Drop it in the comments. And if you're not subscribed yet, you know where the button is. See you in the next one. Bonus: the sounds, the numbers, and the things nobody thought to ask. There are facts about Pokemon that resist categorization, not because they're obscure, but because they operate at a register so basic that players absorb them without consciously registering them, and never think to ask why things are the way they are. These are facts about the infrastructure of the experience, the sounds, the numbers, the visual conventions, the decision rationales that shape every session but live below the level of explicit attention. The walking animation for the player character in Generation 1 cycles through 4 frames: right foot forward, neutral; left foot forward, neutral. This cycle runs continuously whenever the character moves. The specific cadence of the cycle was calibrated against the Game Boy's screen refresh rate and the tile-based movement system's step frequency to produce something that reads as natural walking rather than a puppet being dragged across a map. The 4-frame constraint was a hardware limitation. More frames would have required more sprite memory, and the developers made the 4 available frames work by setting the animation speed carefully. Players who have spent hundreds of hours watching this animation play never consciously registered it as an engineering decision. It worked transparently. The Pokémon Center's healing music, the gentle jingle that plays when Nurse Joy restores your party, varies between regions and generations. But the original version, composed by Junichi Masuda for the first games, was designed to feel like a very brief resolution. A short melodic phrase that begins in mild tension and arrives at its final note with the specific quality of something finished. It plays in a loop timed to the healing animation's length. The emotional effect, that the moment of healing feels genuinely restorative, like a small exhale, was intentional. Masuda has discussed in interviews that the compositional challenge in game audio is scoring experiences that repeat many times across a playthrough without becoming irritating, which requires finding the emotional register that sits comfortably below conscious attention. The battle music for trainer encounters in the original games uses a consistent structural pattern, an ascending opening phrase that signals urgency, a sustained midsection that maintains tension across the battle's duration, and a looping structure that returns to the opening phrase without resolving, keeping the sense of ongoing conflict alive as long as the battle continues. The victory fanfare that plays when the battle concludes was designed to feel like a release, specifically calibrated against the tension of the battle music, a brief resolution that the sustained tension makes emotionally satisfying, even though, taken on its own, it's a very simple 8-note sequence. The Game Boy's speaker system in 1996 was limited in ways that directly shaped the sound design decisions across the entire first generation. The speaker produced a small diameter cone sound adequate for voice clarity in handheld communication devices for which it was originally designed, but with a frequency response that fell off significantly at the lower end of the audible range. Bass tones either didn't translate through the speaker or emerged as distorted versions of themselves. Pokémon's composers and sound designers for the first generation worked almost entirely in the upper frequency ranges where the speaker performed well, which is why the first 2 generations of Pokémon music has a particular tonal profile, bright, clear, slightly thin, that changed noticeably when the Game Boy Advance's improved audio hardware arrived with Ruby and Sapphire. The number 251, the total Pokémon count through Generation 2, is one of the franchise's most significant design numbers and is not a round number. Game Freak has not given a public rationale for stopping at 251 rather than 250 or some other cleaner figure. The Pokédex in Gold and Silver runs to number 251, with Celebi as the final entry. The gap between the first generation's 151 and the second's additional 100 results in 251. Fan communities have speculated that the numbers 151 and 251 were chosen partly because they are both prime numbers, indivisible, unable to be factored into smaller whole numbers, and that Game Freak found this mathematically satisfying. No documentation confirms this. The numbers may be coincidental products of design decisions made for other reasons. Generation 3's jump to 386 total Pokémon, adding 135 new creatures across Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald, was the largest generational expansion in the franchise's history at the time it happened, and it created a collection management challenge that the games addressed through transfer systems more complex than any previous generation had required. The Battle Frontier in Emerald brought the total feature set for Generation 3 to a scope that many fans consider the high point of post-game content design in the franchise, a judgment that persists across subsequent surveys conducted decades after release. The Battle Frontier's 7 facilities, each with distinct rules, distinct AI trainers with sophisticated movesets, and a progression system tied to earning Frontier symbols, kept players engaged in the game long after the main narrative concluded. Its absence from subsequent remakes Omega, Ruby, and Alpha Sapphire replaced the Battle Frontier with the simpler Battle Maison, was one of the most sharply expressed fan disappointments in the franchise's modern era. The repel mechanic, the items that prevent wild Pokémon encounters for a fixed number of steps by applying a scent effect, works through a comparison check against your lead Pokémon's level. Wild Pokémon whose level is below your lead Pokémon's level will not trigger random encounters while repel is active. Wild Pokémon whose level is at or above your lead Pokémon's level can still appear. This level check means that repel is more effective when your lead Pokémon is at a higher level relative to the area's wild Pokémon, something the item's description in the games never explains. Players who wondered why repel sometimes failed to prevent encounters were experiencing wild Pokémon whose levels exceeded their lead Pokémon's, a fact the game left them to deduce. The Super Repel and Max Repel items are functionally identical to repel in their mechanic. The same level comparison applies, and differ only in the number of steps the effect lasts. Super Repel covers more steps than repel. Max Repel covers the most. The price-to-coverage ratio between the three items has been calculated by the competitive community to make Max Repel the most economical option per step when purchased in bulk from shops. This efficiency analysis was never provided by the games. It required external math applied to the in-game price points. The bicycle in Generation 1 doubles the player character's movement speed across the overworld. It requires a dedicated party item slot removed in later generations when key items were given their own separate menu. The Bicycle Club in Cerulean City will give you a bicycle on indefinite loan if you show them a bicycle voucher obtained from the Pokémon Fan Club president in Vermilion City. The club won't sell you a bicycle. The in-game price listed for a bicycle is 1 million Poke Dollars, a number so far above any achievable amount of in-game currency that it functions as a design joke rather than an actual price point. The maximum amount of money a player can hold in Generation 1 is 999,999 Poke Dollars. The bicycle costs 1 million. The game made the bicycle purchasable only through a social favor, not commerce, by the simple expedient of setting its price $1 above what the economy could accommodate. The experience curve system in the original games divided Pokémon into 4 categories: fast, medium, slow, and slow, each with a different mathematical relationship between experience points accumulated and level achieved. Medium slow has an unusual property. At very low levels, it produces a slower level rate than slow, but overtakes it at higher levels and then accelerates faster than any other curve past certain level thresholds. A Pokémon on the medium-slow curve that levels from 1 to 100 requires fewer total experience points than a Pokémon on the slow curve, but requires more experience in the earliest levels. Players who raise their Pokémon to level 100 through sustained training notice that some Pokémon seem to level unusually quickly in the mid and upper level ranges, without having any explicit explanation for why. The Pokédex completion reward in Generation 1 is a diploma, a certificate from Game Freak, congratulating you on completing the Pokédex. The text of the diploma was written by Masuda, whose name appears in it. The diploma acknowledges that you have obtained all 151 Pokémon, which, at the time of the game's release, required either access to every version, a reliable trading partner for version exclusives, and the ability to attend or know someone who attended the events where Mew was distributed. Completing the Pokédex in 1996 was a genuine social achievement involving coordination across multiple people. The diploma that rewarded it was a piece of text that appeared on screen for a moment before returning to the game. Players who accomplished the task accepted this with the equanimity of people who understood that the diploma was not the point. These games hold more than any single video could contain. The archaeology is ongoing. If you've sat with this for the full length, wherever you are in the world, whatever hour it is there, that's time genuinely well spent, and I mean that. Thank you. See you next time. Final notes on collecting and being collected. One last thing worth sitting with before the end. The word Pokémon comes from Pocket Monster's Poketo Monsuda in Japanese, and the act of pocketing a monster, of reducing something wild and autonomous and extraordinary to a portable, containable form that fits inside a device in your hand, is a strange and slightly troubling metaphor when you examine it. The franchise has always known this, The best entries in the series Black and White, most explicitly, Legends, Arceus, with its restrained approach to the violence of the catching mechanic, the mystery dungeon games that invert the perspective, entirely engage with the moral texture of the franchise's central action rather than simply performing it. You are, in all these games, a collector. You are building a collection by taking things from their contexts and placing them into a structure of your own design, organized by your choices, subject to your disposal. The Pokédex frames this collection as scientific documentation. The games frame it as friendship and partnership. The competitive scene frames it as optimization of a resource. Each frame is accurate to a part of what the franchise actually is, and none of them captures all of it. What Tajiri built, underneath all the frames, was something about attention, about the reward that comes from looking carefully at the world around you, at the creatures that live in it, at the systems that govern how they behave, about the connection that exists between human beings who share the vocabulary of having cared about the same things, found the same creatures, traveled through the same tall grass and shallow water. The franchise at its best is about what it means to pay that quality of attention and what you find when you do. 1,000 Pokémon later, dozens of games, 30 years of accumulated mythology, playground legend, data mine discovery, and community archaeology. The franchise is enormous now, in ways Tajiri couldn't have anticipated when he was sleeping in the Game Freak office in 1993, working without pay, building the thing because stopping wasn't something he considered. And embedded in all of it still is the original impulse. Something is out there, in the places you haven't checked yet. Go look. Share what you find. That's all of it. Thank you for making it here.